Good morning. Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to the Newport Symposium. Yes. My name is Leslie Jones. I'm the Director of Museum Affairs and Chief Curator for the Preservation Society, and it is my honor to welcome everybody back to our reintroduction of the Newport Symposium after a few years' hiatus. The Newport Symposium began in 1993. It was the brainchild of Ralph Carpenter, David Dangermond, and Angela Fisher, which I'm proud to say Angela and David are both joining us on Zoom, so hello there out on the internet. And unfortunately, Mr. Carpenter is not with us anymore, but I hope that we do their original intention justice today as we bring this idea back to our audience. The Newport Symposium has long been known for excellence in scholarship, bringing together research from some of the best minds in our field, and today is no exception. We have an incredible lineup of speakers. We are so grateful to them for being here with us, and we look forward to hearing more as they discuss the Italian influence in Newport as well as in the Gilded Age. Now, you may think about Newport from sort of a purely general aesthetic perspective as French. We're in a French ballroom right now. Unfortunately, there are no Italian ballrooms that would fit our size of audience, but if you look closer under the surface, so much of what drives a lot of the presentation spaces of Newport are actually rooted in Italian design principles. And so our speakers will be talking about that today. You will then get to go visit those places, which is going to be an integral part of the Newport Symposium going forward. It's not just being talked at, it will be being in and experiencing these design ideas and cultural contexts and material culture and decorative arts. So we're so glad you're here on this journey with us. I want to thank the Newport Symposium Committee, many of whom are represented here today. In person, we have our co-chairs, Ulysses Dietz and George McNeely, chair people Chaz Miller, Pauline Metcalf, Lydia Kimball, with us virtually, like I said, Angela Fisher and David Dangermond, David Diefenbach, and Lynn Roberts. I also want to thank one of our board members who's joined us today, Sue Petrovas, an international council member, Anne Poulet, as well as the staff of the Preservation Society. Trudy Cox, our CEO and executive director, who has helped foster the redevelopment of this program, bringing it back to our audiences, our special events and development departments, our properties departments, and then very much in particular, of course, the Museum Affairs team. And I want to give a special shout out to Mackenzie Moran and Kate Pedersen. Kate has been the magic behind the scenes. Mackenzie with your registration, Kate with the logistics. This has been a coordinated effort that has been years in the making, so I want to give a special moment to thank them for all their hard work. It is my pleasure to now introduce our first speaker, Nat Silver. I should also mention, too, over the course of today, you're going to be inundated with a reminder to register for our next Newport Symposium. If you haven't gotten the hint yet, we put save the dates everywhere. You can't avoid it. Registration's not yet available online, but it will be very soon. We're looking forward to investigating the French influence in Newport come November. And in breaking with tradition, one of the few ways in which we're breaking with tradition of the Newport Symposium, we will be moving the dates for the symposium to November going forward. And a lot of that is to help with the costs associated with this program. Hotels are cheaper in Newport. The weather will be lovely, hopefully not rainy. Maybe some beautiful leaves still clinging to the trees in various color waves. So we look forward to welcoming you back to Newport every November for the symposium going forward. And the dates for that will be Thursday, November 6th and Friday, November 7th. So mark your calendars. Now, on to our first speaker, Nat Silver. Nathaniel Silver is the Associate Director and Chief Curator for the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. He has 15 years of experience in fine art museums and cultural institutions, including the Frick Collection, J. Paul Getty Museum, Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, and as Executive Director and CEO at Hancock Shaker Village. In his previous role at the Gardner as the William and Leah Peruvu Curator and Collection and Division Head, Silver oversaw collections, conservation, and archives. Boy, do I know what that feels like. And curated or co-curated more than a dozen exhibitions. These include the acclaimed Titian, Women, Myth, and Power, and Boston's Apollo, Thomas McKellar and John Singer Sargent. He holds a PhD in art history from University College, London. So I would hope you will join me in welcoming Nathaniel Silver to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Newport on this blustery April morning. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you to the Preservation Society for this warm welcome and for the organizing of this marvelous symposium. So I'm going to speak a little bit this morning about Italy and the American collector. I will talk a little bit about Newport, and I'm also going to focus as a cornerstone of the talk on Isabella Stewart Gardner, the founder of the museum where I work, and some of her peers in the Gilded Age, and in particular to focus on their interest and their pioneering acquisitions of Italian painting, their interventions in bringing those works of art to the United States, which set the tone for a particular taste in American museums across the country. For an art historian, it's hard to visit Newport without thinking of Italy. The panoramic vistas, the monumental architecture, and last but not least, the close proximity of everything to the ocean. And I realize I wrote this on a sunny day. But at the same time, the changeable weather and driving rain are very much a part of the Italian landscape as well. Just think of the breakers and its great hall inspired by the courtyard palaces of Italy, its library with bookshelves reminiscent of windows on a Florentine palazzo, and its deeply coffered ceiling like that of Florence's Signoria or City Hall. In the Gilded Age, as today, architects worked hand in hand with interior designers. Oh, jumped ahead a little bit. Especially when selling paintings so large that they served as walls or ceilings of the planned room. The Paris-based interior designer Jules Allard, who I was speaking to someone about a little bit earlier this morning, and I know is a name familiar to many, sourced remarkable Rococo canvases from the Lagoon City and found new homes for them here in Newport, which became, in a certain way, its American sister city on the water. One of the most extraordinary of those paintings was Gian Antonio Pellegrini's Minerva for the library of Palazzo Pisani, which became the ceiling of Alva Vanderbilt's bedroom at Marble House. This was not an outlier. And here is a wonderful picture of Alva Vanderbilt in Venetian costume, so very appropriate to the painting in the room. This was not an outlier. With the new construction of palatial private residences treated as a competition sport, interior design became a growth industry, and the leading lights turned to Venice and its surroundings for paintings by the yard, almost, to cover all that square footage. Giambettino Cignaroli's Venus ceiling from Palazzo Labia in Venice furnished Robert Goitlit's cottage at Ochre Court, now the administrative hub of Salve Regina University, and I'm sure many of you have seen it. And equally massive canvases, including the Triumph of Scipio from the library in Ca Corner in Venice and repurposed for Edward J. Berwind's The Elms. That Jules Allard ran quite a business. Turning from the architecture and design, which I know we'll hear about from experts today, I'd like to focus a little bit on the collections such rooms and buildings contained. Why? Well, the taste for Italian Renaissance paintings, shaped by private collectors during the Gilded Age, helped to establish early Italian art as foundational to new civic museums taking shape across the country in every city, from Cleveland to Seattle and beyond. And when I say early Italian paintings, I just want to be clear, I'm not talking so much about the 18th century works, which I introduced my talk with, but really the 14th and 15th century works by Italian painters, often on gold grounds, sometimes not, and very often religious paintings. While much of this unfolded beyond Newport, certain visitors to Newport were instrumental in the efforts. J.P. Morgan was one of those, a Newport regular who owned the 185-foot Corsair and raced it in these waters. There was a Corsair 1, 2, and 3, so I'm showing you here the one against the city of Venice. Morgan's purchasing power was legendary. It's estimated that he spent around $60 million on art alone. And it was as legendary as his interest in all things Italian. He acquired remarkable painted and gilded manuscripts from Florence and Venice, Renaissance sculptures, and early gold-ground paintings. And between 1902 and 1906, he built his famous library in New York, of course, in a Renaissance Italian style evocative of its holdings. Morgan's personal lawyer, John G. Johnson, was described by one contemporary as the greatest lawyer in the English-speaking world. And he was also a collector and a Newport visitor. Famously reticent, he was infrequently photographed, here's one of the rare ones, left no diary, not unlike Isabella Stewart Gardner herself. Born to a school teacher and a blacksmith, he rose to great heights in the legal profession and was celebrated for his work ethic, arguing 168 cases in front of the Supreme Court, mostly in defense of large corporations like Standard Oil. His wife introduced him to Newport, and they summered at Marylton, the family property, and today one of the city's historic Bellevue estates. Note the Italianate architecture with arched windows reminiscent of a Tuscan palazzo from the era of a Medici prince. After 1892, he began buying old master paintings, accumulating 1,279, which were bequeathed to the Philadelphia Museum of Art upon his death, many of which, a good deal of which, were Italian primitives, so Italian gold ground and early paintings. I'll come back to these two men later, but one thing they had in common was a love of early, sometimes called Gothic Italian pictures. That passion was not only shared by Isabella Stewart Gardner, but championed by her, and even before them. She too built a palace, here it is in Boston, but one conspicuously different than her contemporaries in Newport. Instead of lavish marble exteriors, Gardner built something quite simple on the outside and yet alive, literally, within. She filled it not only with flowers, but above all with art, and especially art from Italy. This talk today will explore her crucial role in shaping the taste for Italian art in the United States, and discuss peers like Morgan and Johnson who followed in her footsteps, beginning with the early history of Italian pictures in America, and then focusing on Isabella herself, a pioneer in bringing Italian culture of the past to the United States. Now, Italian pictures were not always so popular in the States. Shortly before Isabella's marriage in 1860 and moved to Boston in that year, the writer Nathaniel Hawthorne visited Florence and toured the galleries of the Galleria dell'Accademia, better known for its Michelangelo, but at that time for its paintings, where he disdained any paintings, quote, shaped quaintly in Gothic peaks and arches and still gleaming with the backgrounds of antique gold, unquote. He added, Giotto, Cimabue, and others of unfamiliar names to me are among the earliest, and except as curiosities, I couldn't be less interested. Hawthorne, like many other Italy-loving Americans, disdained early Renaissance painting and instead reserved his praise for the later periods, the Baroque, for instance, the Guido Renis, the Carlo Dolcis, and the Domenichinos. But that was all beginning to change. There's the Galleria dell'Accademia, that some of the pictures that Hawthorne saw. The transition of taste from Baroque paintings to the emergent interest in gold grounds was satirized later by Edith Wharton's novella False Dawn. In that novel, a recently turned 21-year-old Louis Racy, the heir to a New York industrial fortune who is sent to Europe to buy pictures and build a collection for the family, goes to Italy. Rather than acquire copies of masterpieces by artists whom his father could only dream of possessing and whose prices range far beyond their means, Louis chooses a different direction. Buying up originals by overlooked masters, he returns to New York with Giotto's and Piero della Francesca's. Far from thrilled, Louis's father finds his aspirations hijacked by his son's Gothic paintings. He changes his will, excluding his son and leaving him only the pictures that led to his rejection. The young man sets up a small museum of Christian art in an unfashionable neighborhood in New York and lives out his life in obscurity. The fictional character Louis Racy reflected real-life experiences of two Americans, Thomas Jefferson Bryan and James Jackson Jarvis. Both built collections of primitives in Italy and brought them to the United States long before the taste for such art became palatable, let alone popular. Bryan, the heir to a fortune built on one of John Jacob Astor's partners returned from Europe with a collection of 230 pictures, including gold grounds, to demonstrate the progress or the advancement of the great schools of painting. To say that not everyone shared his enthusiasm would be an understatement. Henry James disparaged them as, quote, worm-eaten diptychs and triptychs, unquote. Not a recommendation. When the pictures failed to find a buyer in New York, Bryan, like Wharton's fictional Louis Racy, set up his own gallery of Christian art on Lower Broadway. James Jackson Jarvis found little more success. His attempt to place the collection at a museum in Boston received the endorsement of Charles Eliot Norton, the founder of Harvard's art history program, but the trustees refused, and they ended up in a failed auction, eventually acquired by Yale in exchange for a defaulted loan. Quantity was the defining feature of these early collections of Italian primitives. In one letter from Jarvis to Norton, he described a single purchase of 44 paintings. Quality could hardly be expected during this period that predated the first encyclopedic catalogs of Italian painters by name. So it's hard to know what you're getting if you don't have a reference guide to be able to look up the painters. And Jarvis and Bryan rarely owned the giottos they claimed, although their bulk purchases occasionally netted a few standouts, and here are a couple of those. More continued to enter the country in an almost accidental way. For instance, bringing us back to Newport here, the furnishing of Marble House, first occupied in 1892, brought a few early Italian paintings to Newport. The Vanderbilts' installation of the Gothic Room featured 2 Tuscan gold ground pictures. You can see one of them, I can't point to it here, but it's on the far left-hand side of the picture. As well as Piero di Cosimo's remarkable building of a palace, and that's the picture in the middle, a subject that must have resonated with its owners. They bought nearly the entire room in bulk from the French art dealer and decorator Émile Gavet, and its symmetrical installation, the room's symmetrical installation, closely resembled his Parisian atelier. For another visitor to that atelier, to that gallery, Gavet's vision was not encompassing enough. Atlantic Coast Railroad heir and president Henry Walters went even bigger, mass purchasing the entire Roman collection of Vatican official Marcello Massarenti. He brought to Baltimore over 1,700 objects, including the first Virgin and Child painting by Raphael in America. Yet such vast collections also had advantages. While art education had largely focused on the present, historians and their universities began to look to the past, to the foundations of painting, very much the context in which gold grounds were increasingly seen. The Jarvis collection helped to transform Yale's department into the center for the study of the history of art, offering hands-on experience to supplement lectures and studio courses. Harvard, so here we're looking at the Fogg Museum, was also ahead of the curve. By 1905, the Fogg possessed 15 Italian primitives, an area in which they soon took the lead. With less pressure to own the highest quality pictures, university museums exploited this latitude to expand into new fields like gold grounds and to put them to use practically in the classroom. Taste changed slowly in large civic museums, where then as now decisions were made by large committees, more money was at stake, and other areas of collecting took priority. By 1900, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and Philadelphia possessed very few early pictures. An example from the MFA here of Carlo Crivelli's Lamentation, sold to Boston's MFA by Ned Warren in 1902, stands out, but hardly constituted a collection of them. Like that of many American museums, the paintings department of the Metropolitan looked abroad for advice, bringing in connoisseur, critic, and lecturer Roger Fry. Here he is with his wife Helen. He noted the museum's shortcomings on his arrival. Quote, "We have as yet no Byzantine paintings, no Giotto, no Mantegna, no Botticelli, no Leonardo, no Raphael, and no Michelangelo." Fry did acquire some fascinating pictures, including this John Bono, but made little headway in addressing the major gaps that he mentioned. Even when the budget could sustain Fry's ambitions, he faced competition even from the museum's own trustees, as was so famously the case with this Fra Angelico painting, reserved by Roger Fry for the Met, but subsequently purchased by the museum's own trustee, J.P. Morgan, for his own private collection. He subsequently sold it. It's now in Spain. The competition for these pictures included Henry Walters, Philip Lehman, who was then working with his son Robert, Joseph Widener, J.P. Morgan, and of course, Isabella Stewart Gardner. Together, their collections opened up the field of early Italian paintings in this country, introducing new and authentic examples for the first time. At the same time, these collectors shared a preference for displaying their paintings in neo-Renaissance interiors, whether open to the public for private consumption, whether open to the public or for private consumption only. Gardner, Morgan, and Walters built Renaissance-style palazzi, while Widener and the Lehmans reimagined their rooms to decorate, a little behind here, there's the Morgan Library and the Walters, while Widener and the Lehmans reimagined their rooms to decorate opulent houses. There's the Widener's Raphael room at Linwood Hall. And that's an impression that can still be felt today in the Met's purpose-built wing dedicated to the Lehman collection. You really get a sense of the lived environment in the Lehman collection. Such common interests were hardly accidental. These collectors shared advisors and agents, as well as philanthropic and professional commitments. Morgan, for instance, enlisted both Johnson and Walters to the Met's board, the latter of whom became vice chairman. This is great. Morgan's buying power was all-encompassing and satirized here in this Punch magazine cartoon, often reproduced, called The Magnet, and you can see why. Charles Eliot Norton alluded to it when advising Gardner against buying an illuminated manuscript in 1902, since, as he said, the price asked seems rather Mr. Morgan than for you. Prices for early Italian paintings, like the Madonna and Saints that hung in the bedroom of Morgan's London residence, had not yet soared. But Morgan's taste in art, like his opinion in finance, could move markets. His biggest gold ground purchase, 16 Sienese pictures acquired in 1904, remained in London, but they gave the art world much to talk about, that is, the American art world, and likely contributed to their popularity in the States. So this one, for example, was a Giovanni di Paolo that was part of Morgan's collection, and you can find it today in the National Gallery in London. In addition to bigger names like Duccio, and just pausing on Sienese pictures here for a second, some of you may have seen the recent exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, wonderful exhibition of Sienese 14th century paintings. This was very much the kind of taste that some of these collectors were pursuing. In addition to bigger names like Duccio, this trove included works by the lesser-known but eminently trendy Giovanni di Paolo, so slightly later, early 15th century painter. When 4 years later, Bernard Berenson solicited Isabella Stewart Gardner to buy another jewel-like panel by the same artist, he added, "Giovanni di Paolo is all the rage right now." Morgan's lawyer, John G. Johnson, collected too, but more independently. Building knowledge from experience, he traveled, although only twice, to Italy, and did plenty of his own research, while at the same time working with scholars to supplement it. By 1898, hints emerged that his collection might go to the city of Philadelphia, a bequest made upon his death in 1917. Henry James characterized the collection as dazzling, but Bernard and Mary Berenson were more circumspect. Of visiting Johnson's home in 1904, Mary wrote, "He has some good things, but no masterpieces. And the perfectly awful thing is the way his pictures are placed, all over the walls and doors, on easels and on morning stands. You can hardly move." Johnson bought plenty of bargains and sometimes got what he paid for, but the collection grew beyond the limits of Mary's slight praise, eventually including Botticelli's, a Masaccio, Fra Angelico, and others. In fact, it's become one of the leading collections. It became one of the leading collections of Italian early pictures in this country. She chose her words carefully, though, for she was writing to Isabella Stewart Gardner, who owned the single most important collection of early Italian paintings in the United States, and largely sourced by Mary Berenson's husband, Bernard Berenson. And now to Isabella. A New Yorker by birth and a Bostonian by marriage, Isabella Stewart Gardner made collecting her life's work. Gardner traveled all over the globe, over 37 countries in her lifetime, and brought a slice of her cosmopolitan life home to Boston. The collection encompasses over 20,000 objects, including archival material, and was produced in a dizzying array of places and times, from the Hellenistic world and the Han Dynasty to 14th century Persia, New Spain, and the America of her contemporaries, including works by John Singer Sargent, James McNeill Whistler, Paul Manship, and Dodge McKnight. Yet at the core of the collection is Italy, exemplified not only by the outstanding group of paintings which we'll look at, but the very building that houses them. So we're looking here at the outside of the museum, whose inspiration was the setting and architecture of Venice in the 14th and 15th centuries. Always one for surprises, Gardner realized this unique design by inverting the arrangement of a typical Venetian palazzo. So that is, she brought the balconies that would have been on the outside of a palace in Venice to the inside to furnish the courtyard. The lagoon city was one of her favorite destinations. Beginning in the 1880s, she and her husband Jack made regular pilgrimages, often renting one of the city's countless Renaissance palaces. For the right price, owners of Palazzo Barbaro, seen here in the photograph and the interior in the Sargent painting, welcomed rich Americans behind facades of crumbling grandeur. These treasure houses contained paintings, sculpture, and decorative arts accumulated over centuries, evoking the glory days of a city built on the multi-generational fortunes of its merchant princes. Not surprisingly, this same paradigm was cherished by old Boston families, whose own wealth derived from the profits of trade in their American port city. Gardner's collecting did not begin with the museum, but was a lifelong pursuit whose origins date back long before its construction. Already in the 1860s, she was buying in Boston, during her travels and also through dealers, agents, and friends. Thanks in part to her friendship with Charles Eliot Norton, again, professor of history of art at Harvard, Renaissance art was an abiding fascination. Less well known is that books were her gateway to great paintings by the early masters. Norton and Gardner first met when she purchased a season ticket to his public readings of Dante's Divine Comedy. By 1885, they were close friends, and he inducted her into the Dante Society. First led by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, this group promoted the study of Dante's works in America. Norton encouraged her to help them by acquiring early examples of the Divine Comedy, beginning with this one. In 1887, Gardner shared her enthusiasm in a letter to Norton written during a buying spree in London. She wrote, "Books, I fear, are a most fascinating and dangerous pursuit, but one full of pleasure, and I owe it entirely to you if I have made a good beginning." 2 weeks later, she acquired a copy of the first Florentine edition. Featuring engraved illustrations after drawings by Botticelli, it became that artist's first work to reach American soil. By contrast, the paintings of Botticelli, with which we're probably more familiar, already well represented in Italy, England, and France, had not yet reached American shores. Acquisition of authentic examples demanded specialist expertise and more money than Gardner could yet afford, a circumstance that was about to change. In 1891, Gardner's father died, and she inherited $2.75 million. Thinking about that sum today, it's about $80 million in today's money. This financial windfall hardly put her in the same league as Frick and Morgan, but it transformed the scope of Gardner's ambitions. Venturing for the first time into the field of Italian pictures, a market filled with copies and forgeries, expert guidance became imperative. It materialized through her timely reacquaintance with an old friend. When Bernard Berenson wrote to Gardner in 1894, their friendship was already a decade old, dating back to the young man's college days at Harvard when Gardner had co-sponsored his first trip to Europe. Now, the budding connoisseur prepared to make his mark on art history, signaled this newly formed expertise to her by sending a copy of his first book, The Venetian Painters of the Renaissance. I should just stop there for a second and say that Gardner co-sponsored this trip to Europe with several other people. Berenson went to Europe, settled in Italy, and never came back. So it became more than a trip. He made his home there and made his living there as well. Several months later, he asked Isabella Stewart Gardner, "How much do you want a Botticelli?" Gardner acquired the Earl of Ashburnham's painting, The Rape of Lucretia, seen here in her Beacon Street residence, in 1894, and this painting became the first Botticelli in the United States. For all they meant to each other, Gardner's business relationship with Berenson was hardly exclusive, and she relied on many individuals to help her build the collection. The painter and friend Joseph Lyndon Smith proved similarly indispensable, constantly on the lookout for promising purchases. His letters offer a reminder that Gardner, like many contemporaries, often bought sight unseen in a pre-email attachment world, relying on drawings and photographs with accompanying testimonials. For instance, on the basis of this tiny sketch, it's about that big, He unsuccessfully proposed a gold-ground triptych, which is actually over 6 feet tall and is today in Perugia, in Italy, at the Museo Nazionale. Whatever put Gardner off in this purchase, it was neither the size nor the profusion of gold leaf. A few years later, she acquired this, Giuliano da Rimini's monumental dossal, also sourced by Smith from the studio of a London restorer. Photographs often proved a more effective sales technique, especially when the artist in question was highly sought. In 1903, this black and white print secured her ascent for a Hercules fresco by Piero, becoming the first of Piero della Francesca's works in the United States. In 1899, this was also how she acquired America's first Mantegna, but through Richard Norton, the son of Harvard professor Charles, and who was then working as an archaeologist in Rome. Such competition perpetually dismayed poor Berenson. He opined about the Mantegna, but oh, I do wish you had not bought it without consulting me. When Gardner later acquired Gentile Bellini's seated scribe at the court of Mehmed II through the portraitist Anders Zorn, who's seen here in the self-portrait, Berenson was left seething with envy. Occasionally, he even intercepted offers before they reached her, such as from the Carfax Gallery, and to the manager, Berenson replied, "Poor Mrs. Gardner receives hundreds and thousands of such offers. She's become a symbol for all that is expensive, and as a matter of fact, she is very well guided." He was very keen to protect his privileged position, and yet it was Gardner's very openness to multiple sources that gave her an advantage. With many contacts in Italy and elsewhere, she benefited from first refusal on works by artists whose prices would soon climb beyond her means. The acquisitions only increased as her idea for a museum took shape. Between 1898 and 1903, she purchased gold grounds, including Giotto's presentation in the temple, the Fra Angelico you see here, and whole altarpieces like Simone Martini's Polyptych for Orvieto and the Giuliano da Rimini I showed earlier. These works complemented Italian masterpieces of the later Renaissance, or the late 15th and early 16th century, including America's first Botticelli, first Raphael. It wasn't a Virgin and Child painting, it was a portrait, unlike Walters's Virgin and Child, and the first Mantegnas, as well as the Piero della Francesca and one of Michelangelo's presentation drawings. By the time construction got underway of the museum, she possessed plenty of early Italian paintings around which to build her inaugural installations. After Jack passed away in 1898, Isabella moved ahead, buying a parcel of land on the city's marshy Fenway, overlooking its muddy river. Photographs from the archives record her acquisitions of architectural salvage that would give the building its distinctive flavor. In the ultimate curatorial act, Gardner's choices of display and installation began from the ground up. She built the stones of Venice into the very fabric of this building. I love the photo here on the right, because if you look carefully on the ladder, you can actually see Isabella Stewart Gardner there in a long black coat and a hat, telling some of the builders what to do. She even insisted on medieval Venetian construction techniques like the pilings driven into the muddy ground that provided a stable platform for the building's foundation. Many photos, like the ones you see here, were taken with her own Kodak Brownie camera, the boxy apparatus you see in her left hand. In 1901, Gardner finished her museum. She claimed an apartment on its top floor and devoted herself to the installation of the galleries. The fact that she forbid the press until the formal inauguration only heightened expectations. Even the Berensons had to wait. On January 1st, 1903, she opened the doors to Boston society for a gala evening. Leaving the cold winter behind, guests entered a majestic court filled with tropical plants and flowers in full bloom. The Italian doorman that welcomed them, one by one, dressed in a uniform designed by Gardner's friend Joseph Lyndon Smith, is seen here. Waiters served champagne and donuts, while the Boston Symphony Orchestra performed Mozart's Magic Flute in a purpose-built music room. William James wrote to a friend afterwards of a night to remember, quote, quite in the line of a gospel miracle, unquote. I'll say the only person who was unimpressed was Edith Wharton, who said that the champagne and donuts were very déclassé. A month later, the museum debuted to great public acclaim. The newspapers declared it a marvel, a triumph of beauty. Open only select days of the month, Gardner limited crowds to 200 visitors per day. Admission was available by tickets, which could be purchased only at Herrick's for $1 apiece. Behind it all was an educational goal. She wrote, quote, I decided that the greatest need in our country was art. We were a very young country and had very few opportunities to see beautiful things, so I determined to make it my life's work. Visitors were spellbound. Henry James dwelled on its hybrid nature, something between a museum and a palace, calling Gardner's work a great creation. Bernard and Mary Berenson had to wait until a few months later, by which time they too were on the edges of their seats. Mary Berenson wrote to her mother, quote, "I was called up on what they elegantly name the phone, and learned that Mrs. Gardner wished us to stay in until she called. To hear was to obey. They were invited to see the palace. They were transfixed." Mary went on to highlight all of the Italian pictures, and above all, those purchases advised by her husband, observing, "The whole work is a thing of genius. It's the biggest gift Boston has ever had." Gardner continued to rearrange the galleries, moving artworks around the museum. She relocated Chinese and Japanese art to create a dedicated home for the growing abundance of early Italian paintings. The Italian primitives shared space with modern design, as in the case of this tabernacle by a 14th century Sienese painter, Bartolomeo Bulgarini, which is installed above a side table, the little side table covered with a piece of fabric here, that was designed by Elsie de Wolf. She stipulated in 1924 that everything should remain in perpetuity as she left it, and you can see that her wishes are respected to this day in galleries featuring painting, sculpture, and decorative arts, all brought together in a salon-like environment. Like the other galleries in the museum, this one hardly reproduces any existing space from the 19th century or the Renaissance. Instead, it offers a concentration of provocative juxtapositions, which, although I don't have time to detail them here, are structured by very deliberate decisions, and you can see them as you walk through the galleries. I can't end without mentioning Henry Clay Frick. So given that his museum reopens this week after a 5-year renovation, I just want to talk very briefly about the Italian pictures there. Between Gardner and Frick, the parallels of intent, if not aesthetic, are manifest. Born in the same decade and deceased within 5 years of each other, their founders created 2 of the finest collections of European art in the United States and established museums for the public benefit in intimate, purpose-built spaces. While Gardner was a pioneer in the collecting of Italian Renaissance art, Henry Clay Frick brought to the United States some of the finest 17th and 18th century portraits and landscapes, which his daughter Helen supplemented with a spectacular group of early Italian paintings. Henry notably preferred pictures he described as pleasing to live with, a dictum that definitely excluded the gruesome Renaissance subjects like crucifixions and harrowing saints' martyrdoms. A principal exception is Giovanni Bellini's St. Francis in the Wilderness, a picture very much within Frick's taste for landscape, and one on which Bernard Berenson personally congratulated him. Frick benefited from a spending power that Isabella could only dream of, and paid well for the best available examples, even if he was not always the victor. While Gardner managed to land Titian's Rape of Europa in 1896, so the first Titian to come to this country, Frick unsuccessfully pursued its companions, the Bridgewater Titians, from the same mythological series for King Philip II of Spain, an acquisition also advocated by his daughter, Henry Clay Frick's daughter, Helen Clay. However different their collections were in scale, style, and experience, we know that Henry Clay Frick and Isabella Stewart Gardner had the opportunity to share their views on several occasions, and a few surviving pieces of correspondence hint at a clear mutual appreciation. On the 26th of July, 1908, Gardner dined at the Frick's family estate on the North Shore of Massachusetts. He was clearly captivated and wrote admiringly of her personality to his art dealer, Charlie Carstairs, saying, "She's very remarkable in many ways, among other things, her energy of youth." 2 years later, Isabella reciprocated with a dinner at Fenway Court. We know few details about that dinner on the 29th of November, 1910, but the evening was clearly a hit. Frick sent his host a bouquet of red roses in thanks, and she acknowledged his chivalry with her own intimate gesture. "Dear Mr. Frick," wrote Gardner, "I have been arranging the wonderful roses as a bodyguard about my marble warrior, and they are weeping tears of red blood for his death." This deceased combatant was the Spanish effigy of the knight you see here, and she had acquired it several years earlier. Gardner also reciprocated with a tone of equal affection, sending him a rare photograph of her portrait painted by John Singer Sargent that Frick had admired on that visit. I use the word affection deliberately because the gallery, the Gothic room that housed this picture, was not yet part of the public tour of the museum, and her official photographer, authorized to sell photos of all the galleries, was never allowed to include it in his stock. Although Frick's collection was hardly Italo-centric, his daughter Helen ensured that the museum did not lag behind and enlarged its Italian holdings. Thanks to Helen Clay Frick, early Italian pictures are some of the highlights, as you will see soon in its recently reinstalled galleries. I think that Isabella Stewart Gardner, the first woman to build a fine art museum in this country, and the first person to bring many of the leading names of Italian art to this country, would have been thrilled to witness her legacy extended by another pioneering female collector of Italian paintings. Unless, of course, she had wanted to buy them too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nat. And I would like to open it up to the Q&A right now. So if you have a question, please do make your way over to the stand and you can ask Nat. As we wait for people to think of things they would like to ask you, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. So when you entered, the grand staircase was to your right, and the restrooms you can find down there. So you can get up at any time, use the restroom, also grab water back in the salon where you had breakfast, and there are a few snacks out there as well. And I think we have our first question.
Thank you very much for that enlightening talk. I'm curious about the interaction of the gold ground and the architectural settings in which they were created. I assume that they began as personal chapel icons for merchants, and then they became collected into salons, collections, and then lastly museums. Were they originally created to be individual icons? And two, what does it mean when they become juxtaposed and agglomerated like we saw in some of your photographs?
Thank you for that question. It's a great question. It's a big question too, so I'll try to answer. You're absolutely right that many, if not most, of the gold ground paintings I showed were either created for chapels funded by merchant princes and their families in different cities in Italy, or were created for private devotion, that is to say, placed throughout the home in what we would call today secular spaces, but there wasn't really that kind of distinction at the time. Over centuries, the paintings that I showed went out of favor, went out of the taste of the people who had commissioned them and their families, and many of the paintings were, of course, church altarpieces as well. They were put into storage. They were movable property, so they were often the first kinds of objects, like furniture as well, which we'll hear more about today, to be sold off when a family needed money. In fact, if you had a big painting and you could cut it into multiple pieces, you could get more for the sum of the parts than you could for one painting alone. So they were often chopped up by carpenters. And part of the job of art historians today working on this period is trying to put literally the jigsaw puzzle pieces back together. By Isabella Stewart Gardner's time, they're absolutely valued as works of art demonstrating the history of art, demonstrating the progress of painting in that moment and the kinds of accomplishments that were made. And one of the things that's so interesting about Isabella Stewart Gardner is that she's such a pioneer in this area. You know, no one had brought a Giotto painting, a Simone Martini painting, a Fra Angelico painting to the United States before. This was a taste in Europe already. Museums were already collecting in a big way, the National Gallery, the Berlin museums. They were her competition. But it was Gardner who really staked her claim in the United States, and then others who followed in those footsteps, J.P. Morgan, John G. Johnson, Walters, and Gardner then set up her museum in, she decides in 1898 very clearly to do it, and it starts getting underway in 1899, and then others who build museums and follow in her footsteps. And it's in these museums that the works are presented as educational. So they no longer have their devotional function so much, but they have a more educational function. I think Gardner was a Episcopalian. She was very interested in the religious practices of all of the religions throughout the countries that she visited in the world. And she she also saw the spiritual import of these pictures. She was very interested in the religious traditions in which they'd been involved, as she is for objects from other cultures in her collection. So that's something a little bit unique to the museum, to the Gardner Museum, that you see throughout in the way she installed them. I hope I've answered that question.
Thank you.
Sure.
I think you just answered my question, actually.
Well, you can ask it again.
But it was about the competition, and I'm curious about Europe. Like, were there Europeans during this period collecting this stuff, or was this just an American thing?
Oh, it's a great question. So Gardner isn't sort of the first person in the world to collect these paintings and to value them as collector's objects. It's definitely going on in Europe, and it's definitely going on in Europe earlier than it's going on in the United States. So starting in a big way in the mid-19th century, but already even underway a little bit earlier on, the national museums that are getting set up. So the National Gallery in London, for example, the Museo del Prado goes from being the King's collection to being a museum. And of course the Louvre, Italian museums, and it's European museum directors and curators who see early Italian pictures as being fundamental to telling the long arc of art history that they want to tell in their galleries, and making acquisitions. And this is also the time, the early 19th century, in the wake, so going back to Italy, in the wake of the Napoleonic suppressions. So Napoleon has marched through Italy, and the church, the Catholic Church, poses a threat to his authority, so he suppresses all the Catholic Church institutions, the convents, the monasteries, the churches. And when that happens and all the doors close, there's no more money coming in. And suddenly the pictures, which are movable, become one way that that church, that convent can recoup some money, because these pictures are long out of fashion. So they begin selling. Often the Berlin museums were a big buyer. I'll give you an example. The Titian that I mentioned, The Rape of Europa, it was first offered to Wilhelm von Bode, the director of the Berlin museums, and he just can't afford it. And so he has to turn it down. So that was one thing that Gardner benefited from, her spending power. And also just to mention that spending power was not like Frick's, it was not like Carnegie's, it was not like J.P. Morgan's, but early Italian pictures were an area that were not yet popular. The prices hadn't yet gone through the roof. And so it was a very clever area in which to collect, because by getting there first, she also ensured that she could get prices that would soon climb out of her price range.
Nathaniel, thank you. That was just transporting.
Oh, thanks.
I'm going to take us outside, even though the shades are drawn. I was intrigued to see the borrowed views of Olmsted's emerald necklace, and knowing that Olmsted Sr. had previously designed Mrs. Gardner's estate in Brookline. It seems to me that when you look at the dates, at the savviness that you brought to collecting, being at the sort of boot, if you will, on the heel of Olmsted's emerald necklace, her position to have a museum there as a borrowed view. You mentioned Wharton in the note of atmosphere or garden magic. How strategic was that, and how purposeful was that positioning of the museum there on Olmsted's necklace?
Oh, that's a great question. I didn't talk too much about the siting of the museum. So let me just back up for a second. In 1896, we have kind of the first indications in some reported conversations that Isabella and her husband Jack, who's still alive at the time, are thinking of transforming their private collection into something for the public benefit. They're thinking of creating a museum. Originally, it seems, they wanted to do this in their Beacon Street townhouse. They owned a townhouse on 152 Beacon Street, and that picture of the Botticelli Lucretia, that's one of the installations of the Beacon Street townhouse. Jack disagrees. He thinks that there won't be enough room in Beacon Hill to enlarge this building and to give the pictures and the ever-growing collection the space they're going to need. Nothing happens. He dies very suddenly in 1898. He has a stroke. Within 2 weeks, Isabella buys the piece of land on the Fenway, which you're talking about. Now, the Fenway at this time was a bit deserted. You can see it from those photographs. It's pretty empty. There's Olmsted's emerald necklace, And today, there's Simmons College and there's Massart and the MFA, but those weren't there at the time. The Fenway was reclaimed land, reclaimed marshland, and it was commonly known in Boston as the dump because of it was reclaimed land. So you can tell how kind of highly it was valued. Gardner was very clever because she saw an opportunity there. She could get a nice piece of land for not an enormous amount of money. She had the view onto the Olmsted Emerald Necklace, which must have been really important to her because she was building a Venetian-style palace. Just like a palace on the Grand Canal in Venice, she builds her palace on the muddy river, so another small body of water looking out, but instead onto the city, onto a kind of campo, onto a beautiful park of green trees and grass. It also, because the Fenway was not popular and there wasn't anyone else taking the property around her at the time, it meant she could get light from all sides, which was one of the things that Jack had commented she would probably want. And she very clearly makes that decision within that kind of 2 weeks after he died. So she must have been thinking about it for a while, although we don't know exactly, we don't know a whole lot of the details because there isn't a lot of surviving correspondence. But it proves to be an extremely prescient decision. She is able to claim the view. She has more space to expand, should she want to expand, and she does expand. She preserves all the light all the way around the buildings, and she puts her favorite pictures next to the windows so that they get this really nice side light. And it clearly was prescient because within a few years, the Museum of Fine Arts, which exists already in Copley Square, moves to the Fenway. The Boston Symphony Orchestra installs itself on the Fenway. Then you get eventually other colleges around it. I mean, she's really the kind of anchor claim to this neighborhood as Boston's cultural district. So in another way, and not just in her Italian pictures, she's very much a pioneer in terms of the planning and landscaping of this property.
I'm back.
Yes, that's fine.
I'm curious about what incentivized these early American collectors. You mentioned education, legacy. Is it an investment? Like, I think today's collectors are so cognizant of the investment and the value of it. So I'm just curious if that was different.
No, it's a good question. We don't always know, and often there were multiple overlapping rationales. Certainly, when Gardner first starts collecting, I'm not sure she's thinking so much about other people's education. I think she's thinking about her own taste and her own immersion in world cultures, in some ways her own education. And she had little formal education as a young woman, but she kind of becomes self-taught. She enrolls at Harvard University, for example, taking Charles Eliot Norton's courses. And I think she sees collecting as another way of educating herself, and buying books certainly one as well. She has an incredible collection of books, not just rare books. There's also I think for some of the titans of industry, like J.P. Morgan, there's a desire to emulate their predecessors, right? Titans of banking in Florence in the 15th century, like the Medici, who were great patrons of works of art. Buying works by the Medici that they would have commissioned was another way of kind of creating that imprimatur of the cultured titan of banking. So I think it was specific to every different collector. And then, of course, the ones who set up museums wanted to then share that knowledge, looking to the past in Europe for the future in America.
Thank you so much, Nat, for kicking off our Piccolo Simposio.
Thank you so much, Kate, and thank you to all of you.
So good. I'm here to introduce our next speaker, Catherine Hess. So Catherine, from 1984 to 2008, she was the curator of sculpture and decorative arts at the Getty in LA, of course, and then served as a chief curator of European art at the Huntington Museum from 2008 to 2020. She then served as a director of a small art school for underserved young adults until 2023. In her curatorial work, she published, lectured about, and produced exhibitions on European glass, ceramics, furniture, and sculpture. She attended the Museum Leadership Institute at Claremont Graduate University and served on the National Endowment of the Arts Indemnity Panel in Washington for many years. She believes that the craft of art can be a source of profound inspiration, delight, and knowledge. And so she speaks today. Where are you? The Lore of Italy, the case of Gilded Age, Newport, and Chateau-sur-Mer. So,
Good morning, everybody. It's going to take me a second here to get set up. I have dueling laptops. So first of all, I'd like to thank Leslie, Mackenzie, and especially Kate for inviting me and for doing all of the background organization for this event, which is, it's done, as you all can see, remarkably well. Thank you very much. And also to our audiovisual guys for making this run smoothly, although we'll see how that goes. It's now totally up to me. All righty, so I'm assuming you're seeing what I see here, yes? You see my title page? Thanks. Okay. Let's see if I can make this work. Yes. In my paragraph description of this lecture, I argue that a complex blend of yearning, discernment, and insecurity explains why Gilded Age collectors, including George and Edith Wetmore, who you see on the screen, of Chateau-sur-Mer, drew inspiration from Italy in their collecting and decorating practices. We'll explore these claims by answering three fundamental questions. What created the class of wealthy Gilded Age collectors like the Wetmore? Why were collectors like the Wetmores interested in the art of Renaissance Italy? And how were collectors like the Wetmores able to acquire Italian art at this time? So indulge me. First, let me take you to a world where inventions and technology change American life forever. A few men run giant companies and become staggeringly rich. Money consumes politics. Voter suppression is rampant. The gap between rich and poor reaches unprecedented levels. Rising anti-immigrant sentiment results in racist laws restricting immigration, and workers are exploited and have no job security. If this sounds familiar, the world I describe also existed 150 years ago during what is known as the Gilded Age. And here we see on the screen a famous cartoon from Puck magazine of 1904 showing Standard Oil as an octopus, illustrating its vast influence and grip on various industries. A state capital in the upper right, politicians in the lower right, reaching for the White House in the lower left. So John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil, which controlled almost all oil production in the US around 1900. This made him one of the first billionaires in US history. In 1911, the Supreme Court ordered the company broken up under the Sherman Antitrust Act. And I have to apologize because I think my audience is much more informed than I was thinking, so just be patient with me. I'm going to go back to the beginnings here. To remind us, Mark Twain coined the term Gilded Age in his 1874 novel, The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today, in which Twain satirizes greed and political corruption in post-Civil War America. The phrase indicates a superficial veneer of prosperity, masking underlying social and economic problems. Twain writes, quote, "No country can be well governed unless its citizens as a body keep religiously before their minds that they are the guardians of the law and that the law officers are only the machinery for its execution, nothing more." As was recently stated, quote, "Twain was suspicious of populism, jingoism, imperialism, the money-obsessed mania of the Gilded Age, and any expression of mindless American might or self-importance. Recognize that quote, anyone? It was delivered about 2 weeks ago by Conan O'Brien as he was awarded the Mark Twain Prize for Humor. According to a 2018 PBS documentary, in 1897, the richest 4,000 families owned as much wealth as the remaining 12 million. Magnates like Cornelius Vanderbilt, J.D. Morgan, and Andrew Carnegie would be worth tens of billions of dollars today. William Shepherd Wetmore, the man who built Chateau-sur-Mer, made his fortune as a merchant and was worth an estimated $1 million in 1847, around $32 million today. And apologize for graphs, but I thought I'd throw a couple in about income inequality. The graph on the left shows it from 1910 to 2010, and that sort of low point there in the middle of the graph, that kind of stable, nice low point, was changed around 1980, where you see it climbing again with, according to the Center for Public Integrity, the reduction of tax rates for the wealthy, the decline of unions, and the deregulation of the financial sector. But you see it rising again, and I show that small blue graph to the right because it brings us up to 2020, and this is, if you line up those two peaks and overlay them, you see where we are in 2020, and we're in 2025 right now, so you can only imagine where it goes from there. But my point being, Gilded Age on the left, where it's peaking, Gilded Age on the right, where it's peaking again. What were the conditions that created the Gilded Age in America around the turn of the 20th century? America was remaking itself after the Civil War, and the country blew past Europe in industrial growth. Young entrepreneurs had opportunities in mining, oil, steel, banking, and transportation that their predecessors simply did not have. They accumulated wealth like no Americans had before them. What are now called the two Gilded Ages, the one from 1870 to around 1920, and the post-industrial one of today, are periods of excess and corruption alongside technological and scientific innovation. However, and this is important for our topic today, the super wealthy men and a few women of the Gilded Age around 1900 are distinct as actually esteeming art and philanthropy, supporting cultural institutions. As Adam Gopnik writes in the March 3rd edition of The New Yorker, Gilded Age plutocrats around 1900, quote, respected art, even if their motive was just to buy their way into the upper classes. They did ennoble the public realm. Andrew Carnegie, for example, gave away nearly 90% of his fortune to charities, foundations, and universities, establishing the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the New York Public Library, a college that became part of Carnegie Mellon University, and from my perspective, the most compelling, nearly 1,700 libraries across the US. George Wetmore was less active as a philanthropist, though he did support the Metropolitan Opera and Newport Hospital. On to our next question. Why were they interested in the art of Renaissance Italy? As parvenus, wealthy industrialists and their families turned away from the fussy, bourgeois Victorian style of earlier in the 19th century and towards a style that implied a celebrated cultural heritage so as to validate their new social standing. Since most were descended from humble German or British families, they couldn't draw upon family history for this celebrated heritage. Therefore, they looked to the imagined seat of noble culture, Western Europe, especially France and Italy, to reinvent their heritage. They followed the tradition of the Grand Tour, a customary journey through Europe undertaken by upper-class European, especially men, British men, particularly in the 18th century. Such travel served as an educational rite of passage and conferred bragging rights upon the travelers. The route could include Amsterdam, Paris, Vienna, and Munich, but it always focused on Italy, most often Venice, Florence, Rome, and Naples. And you see this route in the 18th century. This is just one of many routes, but the focus really is what happens south of the Alps. Grand tourism, limited to upper-class young men, petered out with the rise of large-scale rail transport and steam-powered ships in the late 19th century. Italian unification opened new routes, and the proliferation of guidebooks helped. One historian writes, quote, "Guidebooks helped make tourist travel a profoundly empowering activity for individual Americans." Wealthy Americans began taking their own grand tours. In this marvelous painting in the Royal Collection, upper-class travelers and connoisseurs, mainly British, gather in the tribuna of the Uffizi to study and appreciate Italy's artistic glories. And if you can make out, they're classical, they're Etruscan, they're Baroque, but they're especially Renaissance. It offers an encyclopedic record of what the Grand Tour meant. So why is it that the Renaissance was so appreciated? The view that it was a high point of civilization was set into motion by Giorgio Vasari, who often called the first art historian. In his Lives of the Most Excellent Italian Sculptors, Architects, and Painters of 1550, Vasari, a Tuscan, invented the genre of an encyclopedia of artistic biographies. He even came up with the phrase Renaissance, Rinascita. In the first English language edition of Vasari's Lives appeared in 1850. After that, guidebooks to the peninsula were sure to include points of interest that reflected Vasari's praise of Tuscany's artistic triumphs. Tourists then followed those recommendations on their travels to Italy. George and Edith Wetmore were two such tourists. So George's father, William Shepherd Wetmore, made the family money in trade with China. And in 1852, he built his summer cottage, Chateau-sur-Mer, although he gave it a French name. He used an Italianate architectural style popular at the time and filled it with Chinese objects and other Victorian-era ornament inspired by British design of the period. At the time, Henry James wrote in a letter to a friend, quote, "I think that to be an American is an excellent preparation for culture. We can deal freely with forms of civilization not our own. We can pick and choose and assimilate and, in short, aesthetically claim our property wherever we find it." Now, I know this might seem elementary, but it also might be helpful. Why is this Italian Renaissance? Why is this Italianate, this structure here? Well, I'm going to walk you through it just a tiny bit. So, pedimented windows and doors are an element. Projecting eaves supported by corbels, another element. Tall, narrow windows, columned porches or porticos, and imposing cornice structures. So just to sort of bring this home, other Italianate houses in America look like this. So you kind of see why we're calling this Italianate. And just to say where these are being inspired from, these are real Italian Renaissance structures, not houses, but we will call them palazzi. Chateau-sur-Mer remained the most magnificent residence in Newport until the Vanderbilt houses were constructed at the end of the century. After William Wetmore died in 1860, George inherited the house, and in 1869 he married Edith Kettletus, about whom woefully little is known other than she hosted parties and acquired furnishings in Paris. George and Edith, it's unfortunate. We want to know more about her. It's just these things, it's hard. If it's not documented, it gets lost to history. Document things. George and Edith then traveled to Europe while the renowned architect Richard Morris Hunt remodeled the house in the French Second Empire style. That the structure was built of local stone made changes to the exterior appearance difficult, though changes were made. And you can see from the vaguely same perspective, the house before and after those, that renovation project, and expansion project, I might say. So what is the Second Empire style under Napoleon III? Well, these are the Napoleon III apartments in the Louvre that were home to the Minister of State, and this type of style inspires interiors like the Green Room at Chateau-sur-Mer. All right. Now, what were they to fill their updated interiors with? There are similarities between Renaissance Italy and Gilded Age America. Like the US after the Civil War, in the 14th century, Italians were migrating from the countryside to the city. Secular architecture flourished, and the wealthy required new grand palaces and villas. All these new structures demanded items to fill them. As the great scholar Richard Goldthwait wrote, quote, "Furnishings of every kind, from pottery and beds to paintings and frescoes, proliferated to fill up interior spaces. These new spending habits were induced by the urban renaissance of the dominant classes in Italian society and the redefinition that gave to the noble lifestyle," end quote. Shopping, craftsmanship, and consumption were big things. Shopping on the left, craftsmanship documented on the top here, and then, of course, consumption. Were big things for the stuff to fill their new buildings. Gilded Age collectors also sought items that provided a, quote, noble lifestyle, and grand European art of the past offered a way to ornament their lives appropriately. And on we are. How did they make their Italian Renaissance and Renaissance-inspired purchases? The answer is through advisors, agents, and dealers. English painter William Blundell Spence, seen here, was one of the most influential figures in developing the taste for Renaissance Italian art. He settled in Florence at the age of 22 in 1836 and spent the remainder of his life there. He began restoring paintings, but after 1870, Spence primarily worked as a dealer specializing in Renaissance objects, paintings, and furniture. This professional path, from painter to restorer to dealer, was common in the second half of the 19th century. As one prominent dealer of the time wrote about restorers, quote, "The best end up becoming art dealers because they eventually understand that it's better to restore for one's own benefit than for that of others." Smart guy. All right. In 1865, Florence replaced Turin as the capital of the newly unified Italy, but 5 years later, the seat of government shifted again to Rome, this time permanently. Florentine businesses, including art dealers, suffered from the relocation, but not for long. New objects poured onto the market as wealthy families began selling off works of art considered out of fashion or otherwise out of place in modern Italy. Moreover, the contents of sprawling rural estates had to be pared down when families moved to urban settings. This liquidation of objects was further fueled by new inheritance limitations, the breakdown of the agrarian economy on which landowners' prosperity was based, and the rebuilding of Florence, sparked by its new, if fleeting, status as first city. Urban renewal included the razing of many buildings in the city center to widen streets, and the dislocated population also fed the market with artworks, selling off objects that were no longer useful or fashionable. James Jackson Jarvis, the writer, art historian, and collector, described Florence as, quote, "the world's capital of bric-a-bracdom," whose art market was as infinite as the coal mines of England. Several of the most significant among the new generation of dealers were based in Florence. Like William Blundell Spence, who we just saw, Stefano Bardini was trained as a painter and expert copyist. When he acquired the deconsecrated Florentine church and convent of San Gregorio in 1881 to serve as his art gallery, Bardini was also it served as his art gallery, and it has been reopened, I think it was, what was it, maybe 15 years ago, and is really a place to see. Bardini was also the first dealer to use photography as a research and documentary tool. Stefano Bardini's first client and most lugubrious man on earth, shouldn't say that, I'm sorry, that's terrible. Wilhelm Bode of Berlin's Royal Museum, renamed Bode Museum in 1956, wrote that in addition to his skills as a restorer, Bardini's particular talent lay in his obtaining access to the best Florentine families who were in urgent need of money and in gaining their trust. Bode also played a big role in the market for Italian Renaissance art, including decorative arts. His 1929 obituary states, quote, "His fame as an art expert extended over the world, and many Italian collectors sought his advice. His word was final." In like manner, as we've heard earlier about this very influential person, Bernard Berenson became arguably America's most influential art historian. Berenson attended Harvard, and among US collectors was the preeminent authority on Renaissance art. And on the left, we see him in front of his Villa Itati in Settignano outside of Florence, which remains a remarkable study center for Harvard University today. Herbert Percy Horn was a writer, art collector, and historian of Italian Renaissance art, moving to Florence in 1904, where he developed a career in art dealing, occasionally partnering with Berenson. He was thought to have smuggled works from Italy to Britain and the United States. He bought and restored Palazzo Corsi in 1911, a 15th century edifice he transformed into a museum of Renaissance life, just down the block from Bardini's museum, and a wonderful small museum in Italy. In a now familiar pattern, Elia Volpi began as a painter before transitioning to restoring artwork for Stefano Bardini. It's a little network here that's working with one another. His skills were refined during a time when replicas of original works of art were commissioned to replace the period objects that families had sold. Ultimately, he chose to become a dealer himself. Volpi was particularly a very talented entrepreneur. In 1904, he acquired the mid-14th century Palazzo Davizi, subsequently called Davanzati, in the center of Florence, which he rebuilt and opened to the public in 1910 as a, quote, perfect reconstruction of a 15th century Florentine house. It was the first private museum in Italy to charge an entrance fee, and it brilliantly disseminated and commercialized the appeal of the Florentine Renaissance. There followed a series of auctions, the most important taking place in New York, that created a collecting frenzy for Renaissance decorative arts. Volpi's sale, organized by the American Art Association in 1916, was momentous, described as the first successful sale of old masters ever held in America. It brought in over $1 million. The sale included more than 1,200 lots sold over 5 sessions. After the New York sales of the 1910s, Volpi rented out his Palazzo Davanzati to other dealers, Vitale and Leopoldo Ben-Guyat, who then bought the building in 1926. The Italian state acquired Volpi's Palazzo Davanzati in 1951 and opened it 5 years later as a museum of the Antica Casa Fiorentina. I must say that current scholarship has identified a mere small handful of objects in this museum as being, let's call it authentic, not cobbled together from other pieces. So one has to visit this Antica Casa Fiorentina with a sort of as a kind of Disneyland experience. As some Italians were ridding themselves of old-fashioned furniture, others were falling victim to the romantic mood of the 19th century. And here we're on firm ground. We're not dealing with any fakes or cobbled together Renaissance-y things. Newly popular were nostalgic revivals of styles of the past, in particular the Renaissance revival. It celebrated what was seen as a high point of Italy's history and was perfectly suited to the nationalistic pride that resulted from unification mid-century. In response, talented furniture designers and cabinet makers, particularly in Tuscany, created inventive variations on Renaissance forms that were as popular outside as within, arguably more popular outside than within. These artists include Egisto Gaiani, Angelo Barbetti, and the great Luigi Frullini, whose marvelous carved interiors ornament Wetmore's Chateau-sur-Mer. Frullini was born in 1839, he initially studied with his woodcarver father. He achieved international fame for his highly visible displays at world fairs, including those in London in 1862 and Paris in 1867, and then in 1878. His work sold well on these occasions, especially to Anglo-Saxon consumers who may have valued the high level of craftsmanship, not dissimilar to that of the arts and crafts movement in Britain. He made works for the daughter of Queen Victoria of England, a portrait for the daughter of the Grand Duchess of Russia, and furnishings of the bridal chamber and living room of Palazzo Ginori in Florence. In London, Sir William Drake, a banker and founder of the Burlington Fine Arts Club, avidly sought neo-Renaissance furniture by Frullini, using Spence as an agent. The relaxed attitude towards period authenticity extended to his treatment of individual objects. In discussing a cassone, a chest, that he had purchased in Florence, Drake wrote to Spence, quote, "I think it better to take off the present feet and put it on a walnut or gilt stand," quote, unquote. But he said that he didn't want to hire, quote, "an expensive man like Frullini for the task." However, he eventually splurged in 1870 when he commissioned Frullini to create furniture for his house in London. An etching of a room of his house shows a table with very similar supports to those on this portfolio, and it's possible that this piece, now in the Victoria and Albert Museum, was part of the set Frullini made for Drake. Frullini worked for Spence on various other occasions, executing frames and tabernacles for ancient paintings, and perhaps also restorations on chests and other Renaissance furniture. Perhaps an advisor for the Wetmores saw his work at one of the world's fairs and suggested they meet him while traveling in Europe. I also heard, I believe it was from Leslie last night, that perhaps they were advised to meet Frullini himself when the Wetmores were traveling through Italy on their way north from Rome, where they stopped in Florence. Frullini was a big name at that point, and maybe he was advised, maybe Hunt advised them to go visit this man as a potential artists to work on their Chateau-sur-Mer. This impressive relief, now at the Metropolitan Museum of the Triumph of Bacchus, may have been an object exhibited in one of those exhibitions because of the prominence of Frullini's signature that you see here. In the 1870s, the Wetmores commissioned the artist to create a dining room and library for Chateau-sur-Mer. The furnishings include wall paneling, chairs, desks, a sideboard, and bookcases. As an aside, Frullini's strange ornament of fantastic animals, which you'll see at the crest of these two chairs. There's a sort of bat-like figure and griffins and all sorts of strange animals here, is perfectly in keeping with the Renaissance, rather mannerist taste for grotesques that are meant to surprise and entertain the viewer. They're not really sort of strange goth elements. That's really something that's supposed to bring a smile to your face. So here is a little walk through these two rooms, which you will see anon. Here is the library, the fireplace. Look at the details when you're in this room. The details are really astonishing. He was a master carver. a sideboard with roundels depicting the four seasons. Here is the dining room in whole. So why the Wetmores were attracted to the Italian Renaissance is not known precisely, because we have no documentation that records their thoughts, no journals, letters, or other written records. We also know nothing of the agents, advisors, or art dealers who might have helped them become acquainted with Frullini's work and place a commission with him. But I think it's safe to say that they followed the fashion for this material among Gilded Age collectors. Italian Renaissance furnishings, whether actually datable to the Renaissance or simply made in the Renaissance style, conferred status and good taste onto the newly rich by associating them with a lauded period of history, lauded particularly among Anglo-Saxon elites. To underscore the distinctions between the plutocrats of 100 years ago and those of today, the Wetmores and their crowd did not threaten or take over cultural institutions. They created them with their philanthropy. They filled them with the art they had acquired and donated. We are fortunate to enjoy and assess this heritage today. To repeat Adam Gopnik's assertion, the Gilded Age tycoons respected art and ennobled the public realm. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine, and would like to open it up to a Q&A.
Yes.
What was the middle thing? You started with 3 points that are important of those in the Gilded Age: yearning, something, and insecurity.
Discernment.
Discernment. Thank you very much.
And insecurity is a little snarky. I mean, you know what I'm meaning, right? It's not really insecurity. It's just establishing heritage.
Please raise your hand if you have a question. I think we're going to move to a hand raise.
Good morning. I wanted to ask, considering the lack of art acquisition standards and processes, how does one go about authenticating these pieces? What is the documentation record that you look for in your research?
Authenticating, is that what one?
Yeah.
Oh, authenticating is different from, well, certainly if there's documentation. If there's provenance, in other words, previous ownership history,
So
that
bills
goes
of sale.
right back, goes right back to the maker, you're good. If, however, you don't have that provenance, and oftentimes with very old pieces of art, it's hard to find provenance that traces right back, you have to rely on, I hate to say it, connoisseurs, really, and AI ain't coming for us, I don't think. It's really about, with pieces of furniture, for example, crawling under, looking at every last piece and keeping an open mind, not taking anything for granted. I'm a furniture person, so I can't really speak to paintings, but it's really an eye that has been trained with experience and documentation, if you can find that.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Charles.
Forgive me as I run around the room.
You should be wearing your little meter for how many calories you're burning today. I think I want to ask you this question because you're someone that's just now parachuted in from California. And I think about our next speaker will be coming in from Florida. And one of the things that's interesting to me about the Italian style or the Italianate is that in California we have California Mediterranean Revival as a style that's widely recognized. We have Mediterranean Revival in Florida, and in both cases it's about using native materials. You alluded to local stone in the construction of Chateau-sur-Mer, and we're all looking at this image right now where the chateau is flanked by the signature beech trees that are defining here in Newport. And so as a space and time traveler that has come here, are there things about the Italianate here in New England that as an outsider that you think is distinct in terms of living and non-living materials?
I have to say, I really haven't looked carefully at the grounds of the houses that I know to be able to answer that smartly. I'm sure there are differences. I'm sure you know the answer. You really don't? Yeah, I wish I could. Does anyone here have any ideas about this? I'm sorry, I'm not able to answer that. I think that we're all responding to climate change with regards to what we're planting. I know this from my years at the Huntington, that there are certain ways that the Huntington looked in the past, and that's having to change with time. I think I'm just tangentially touching on your question.
It's not just the living. For example, if it was Florida, we could talk about oolite stone, right?
Yes.
I mean, for example, the way the house is meeting the ground plane here is then very different than what starts to happen at the breakers, and how things have a platform that rotates around a house.
Right.
So, you know, if we were to compare this to, say, thinking about George Washington Smith in California, who set a tone for that kind of taste-making, I think it's everything. It's the total design environment.
I think one has to use local materials. I mean, that is, look at Vizcaya and look at the crazy stones that they use there that creates a sort of thing that's sort of Venetian, but am I answering? I'm not even coming. Okay, then I'll definitely, then I'll nail it. And I'll nail it.
And everyone is also welcome to speak with our speakers during lunch as well as in the reception. So if you have any further questions as you mull over the talks, you're also welcome to talk to them later. Thank you so much, Catherine.
Good morning. I hope you're all as excited as I am. I'm so excited, I'm not sure I can get through my introduction. I'm Ulysses Dietz. I'm the co-chair of the Symposium Committee with George McNeely. And I've been coming to Newport for something over 50 years as an enthusiast and a tourist. And so these last lectures have been really exciting. I learned about Newport in the same year I learned about James Jackson Jarvis and the Italian paintings at Yale, because I was an undergraduate at Yale and studied with Vincent Scully. And he's the one who sent me to Newport when I was 19. So anyway, I can hardly see straight after all this fascinating material we've been given. And I'm really, really excited to be able to introduce Sarah Cartwright, who is the chief curator and the Ulla Searing curator of collections at the Ringling Museum in Sarasota, Florida. And if any of you have not seen it, the Ringling is one of the most beautiful museums in the world. It's spectacularly beautiful. And I've only been once, and I was so hooked on it after seeing it. Sarah got her PhD in art history and archaeology, which feels very ambitious, at the Institute of Fine Arts in New York, of New York University, which you all may know is housed in Horace Trumbauer's Duke House on Fifth Avenue in New York City, so a little Gilded Age thing there. She was a research associate at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, a Mellon postdoctoral fellow at Columbia University, and a curator at the Villa La Pietra in Florence. And I'll say, I didn't get to Florence until I was 61, and I'm hooked on that too. I hope I go back at least once more. While she was at the Ringling, Cartwright, and get this is also very ambitious, she's responsible for the museum's collection of European and American painting, sculpture, and works on paper from antiquity to 1900. As you can imagine, that's kind of a big slice of art history. She's published and presented a wide array of subjects, which I would think so with that title, from Italian manuscript illumination, which seems logical, to ancient carved gemstones, to the 19th century French painter Rosa Bonheur, someone else who I'm very fond of, because of her importance in American collecting. Her recent projects at the Ringling have included curating the exhibition Shanique Smith Parade, which sounds like something very contemporary, and co-curating the International Loan exhibition of Guercino's Friar with a Gold Earring, Fra Bonaventura Bisi, painter and art dealer, and co-authoring the catalog for that exhibition. I also want to point out that the Ringling has the most important series of Rubens paintings in the United States. So if you haven't been there, you really need to go and see the museum for all sorts of reasons. So let's bring up to the stage Sarah Cartwright, who I've lost visual track of, but here she is.
Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to be here. Thank you all for this invitation. And again, as the previous speakers have done. I just want to thank the Preservation Society and Kate and Leslie and everyone here who's been so welcoming. And in contrast to Ulysses, I am not a Newport regular. So what I'm talking about today are things that I've noticed as I have looked at the breakers, as sort of being assigned this topic, for lack of a better term, which has been endlessly fascinating and really, really fun. And so I appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts with you today. So I'm not a specialist in the Gilded Age per se, but I am an Italian Renaissance person, so it is fun to explore some of these themes that I'll be talking about today. And my title, Fundament and Fantasy, could really be applied, I think, to the whole Gilded Age in a way. By fundament, I mean sort of the fundamentals. It's kind of it's older than 19th century word, but it used to be used to mean something fundamental, right? A fundament, a basic, these elements of architecture and design that we see here. And then fantasy, how they're reinterpreted through a 19th century lens in the sense of revival styles, right? And Richard Morris Hunt, who we'll talk about today, is an excellent example, a wonderful, wonderful, brilliant, knowledgeable architect who created so many original ideas and solutions in looking back at historical styles. So, you're seeing a building, yes? No. Oh, sorry. That's right. You're seeing this. I'm seeing the next slide. So I have 3 sections today. I'm going to start with the breakers, sort of some background, and then we'll move on to some contrasting ideas, and then end with a particular room in the breakers, the library. So this is the entrance facade of the breakers, a building which is described as Italian Renaissance Revival. It is indeed a reinterpretation of Italian Renaissance forms, and it is classicizing, as we expect from the Italian Renaissance and Revival versions. Kind of typical in some ways, but also atypical in other ways. It is generally, it's actually 4 stories. There are windows up under the roof, which you can't see, but generally this 3-story palazzo, which we saw in our previous speakers, some examples of this kind of typical Italian Renaissance palazzo style. It's a brownish stone, which is kind of also interesting. And the sections of the facade are rather simple, but we have heavy coining on the corners, and we have these sections that kind of protrude, that are articulated, which give it interest, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of those basic design features. But it is a 19th century reinterpretation, filtered through the lens of Richard Morris Hunt's training in the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and I find Hunt so fascinating because he really knew so much. He was clearly a scholar of architecture of the past, and when you know it to the degree that someone like he did, it's evident how you can play with these forms and yet create something that's still a consistent statement. So this home, as probably most of you know, was built for Cornelius Vanderbilt II and his wife Alice, and I just show them here to have kind of a family image of the people who used this home as their summer home. Richard Morris Hunt is shown here at the top right in Carl Bitter's relief sculpture portrait of him, which is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum. And this building was built to replace the original breakers, which was completed in 1878 and, of course, burned down in November of 1892. And the design, I show this because it's interesting to me, the decision to build in an Italian Renaissance style. Where does that come from? And we've heard our other speakers today kind of talk about the interest in Italy, Renaissance art, Renaissance style for architecture too, but when you're inhabiting a house that looks like this, and then you decide to rebuild it in a totally different style, that's a decision that I was kind of interested in exploring more. So we'll look a little bit at that. Just to see both facades, the front and the rear facade, both elevations. I think it's often said that this home, it takes its inspiration from palazzos in Genoa. And that may be true. There may be some specific reference that I haven't really seen that forms the basis for this home. But I tend to think that there were other stylistic influences on the home. But it's actually quite genius because it uses these masses to articulate the facade, but it does it, and it's quite simple actually in its form. It's quite monumental, but done with simple elements and using this tripartite window feature, which we'll look at again in a second. But I think part of its genius is this simplicity. It's not overdone. It's easily legible. It's easy to understand this facade and kind of comprehend it from upon first seeing it. It doesn't overwhelm you, and I think that's one of its great strengths. And this is one of Hunt's last homes. Of course, he dies in 1895, and he was working on many other projects in the last few years of his life, but in the sense that it represents a culmination of everything he did and studied, that too is important. It represents all his years of looking, studying, adapting styles, and showcases his particular originality, never copying anything too closely, never trying to copy the past, but use the past as inspiration for a new style, a new American interpretation, which he was passionate about beautifying this country, bringing beauty, bringing culture, and sort of elevating the taste of this country by using the great examples of the past. It's also interesting, we talked with our other speakers earlier today about the interest in the Renaissance. The second half of the 19th century, of course, is a time when the Renaissance as an artistic and cultural phenomenon is being defined in a scholarly way. You have Jakob Burckhardt, the great Swiss historian, who writes The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy in 1860, which is a sort of all-encompassing understanding of what was the Renaissance, what was the ethos, what did it mean. It was really about a renovation of man. This is how Burckhardt interpreted it, right? And Burckhardt's text, which was written in German, gets translated into English for the first time in 1878. So it's in the Gilded Age, in fact, that these ideas are being disseminated widely in the English language. And of course, you also have scholarship that is generating publications about Renaissance buildings, Renaissance art. So even if you couldn't, say, go to Italy, although Hunt, having lived in Europe from a young age and studied at the École in Paris and traveled pretty widely in Europe, even if you couldn't do that, you could buy books which were compendia of, say, building facades. We'll see a page from one of those in a bit. So this idea of what is the Renaissance is actually being, Italian Renaissance in particular, is being defined at this time. And it is also, and Catherine alluded to this in her talk, this is a time when Italy, after its unification, is determining what modern style should be and what should be the examples that artisans, architects, will be reproducing. And of course, the Italian Renaissance is held up as this great moment in Italian history that should be imitated and should be the basis for new work. And so you see Frullini, among many other artisans, using Italian Renaissance style because it alludes to the great heritage of his land. So all of these things are happening kind of at the same time that a building like the Breakers is, these things are happening leading up to a building like the Breakers being built. So here on my next page, this is an example of what I was talking about at the left. This is a German text which reproduces many building facades. And I just wanted to kind of look a little bit more closely at the facade of the Breakers, because what we see and this is a detail, let's see if I can get my laser pointer to work. Will it work? It's not working for me, actually. Let's try one more time. Oh, there it goes. So this, are you seeing my laser pointer? Okay, awesome. I'm used to standing closer to a screen and gesticulating and pointing, so forgive me if this is a little bit harder for me from this vantage point. But this is a detail of the facade of the breakers. And this tripartite form is what I was talking about, which is kind of a combination of two things. It is certainly inspired by Sansovino's Biblioteca Marciana in Venice. This is the library, which is one of the great Renaissance buildings that inspired, many other buildings. But what you see here is this arch, tripartite arch. You have the Doric order columns here, Ionic order columns on the second story, and you have figural sculpture in the spandrels. You also have this, nod to, again, the Greek orders. You have metopes and triglyphs that alternate along this register. And very, very close copy or replica is happening here. Hunt has changed the form of we don't have three arches here, we have one central arch, and I'll get to that in a minute. But we do have the metopes and triglyphs, and they're very close in detail to what Sansovino did. We also have, on this level, we have Doric and Ionic, we have figural sculpture, figures draping the spandrels, we have this balustrade up at the top. This is pretty interesting that he, takes this key Italian building and kind of repeats this form both sides of the front facade and also on the back facade. And he modifies it by sort of nodding to the so-called serliana, or the Palladian window. And you all just passed through one of those, right, coming into this building. This is where we have this archway, the blind, and two smaller columns here. Hunt is not doing that. He keeps his two columns all the way up. They don't end right at the base of the arch, but he nods to the Serliana with these oculi, with these round forms, right, which are figural sculpture here. So he's using a very, very famous basic form, and that is sort of the primary decoration of the facade, of both front and back facade. And I think that's interesting, and it gives the building its rhythm. Oh, another thing is we have in the Marciana, you have this course at the top, this frieze of putti carrying garlands, and that occurs also in the breakers. We'll talk about that in a second. So, again, just some history. Why would we end up with this very Italianate building? It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense given that Hunt was really much more comfortable in the French Renaissance style. And in fact, two previous Vanderbilt homes, these are both in New York City, the one for William K. and Alva Vanderbilt, here, the Petit Chateau on Fifth Avenue, built in 1878 to 1882, and then the home of Cornelius II and Alice, built in 1882, and then expanded and rebuilt in the 1890s. Again, these have very little to do with the Italian Renaissance form of the breakers. And the breakers itself almost didn't become an Italian Renaissance house. It starts out, and when Hunt is proposing to Cornelius, he wants to do a French Renaissance chateau. Very much, it seems. There are a number of these drawings, these renderings from Hunt's office, which propose a French style, a French Renaissance style. And then we start to see in 1893 moving toward Italian Renaissance forms. And I don't really think anyone knows, and correct me if I'm wrong, Kate and Leslie, why this decision was made to go to the Italian Renaissance style. It's been suggested that it could have been a decision to commemorate the quadricentennial of Christopher Columbus, or it could have been a decision that was made to distinguish it from another house, Marble House, which was built by William and Alva here in Newport. And you also have these other French Renaissance style buildings from roughly the same time, Ochre Court, of course, here in Newport, and the Biltmore in Asheville, which was well on its way at the time that Cornelius and Alice were determining what the breakers would look like. So it seems as though there was a very strong decision made to go in this Italian Renaissance direction. And just as a reminder, and some of you may know this, there aren't a lot of buildings that are in the Italian Renaissance style for homes in this period, not sort of to the degree that we see with the Breakers facade, but one important precedent is the Viard houses on Madison Avenue in New York, which were designed by McKim, Mead, and White, and those were built in the 1880s. This was a building that was designed to house 6 separate residences. And the interiors of, this is of Henry Villard's house, those were in fact done in an Italian Renaissance style, leaning toward the 15th century style. So you see this music room which has a kind of Donatelesque cantoria, harking back to 15th century Italian sculpture. Florentine sculpture in particular, and you can see the dining room and the library in a sort of simplified Italian Renaissance form. But I do think that Marble House is an important thing to pay attention to when we're thinking about the Breakers, because this house is completed in 1892 to great fanfare, spectacular party upon its opening, and that party took place just a few months before the old Breakers burned down. So the party to open Marble House happens in August 1892. November is when the Breakers burns. So for sure, I would think, I mean, Cornelius and Alice were well aware of the impact of this home, of William and Alva's home. And this one has a very neoclassical style, of course, built on the model of the Petit Trianon, a French example that Alva seems to have wanted. It's a Louis XV mansion as her model, but this home was built at great expense with period rooms of various styles, as you all no doubt know. We have I'll just go to my next slide. Here, I just have one period room, the dining room, just to remind us of the lavishness of the interiors of this home. And looking at the facade, you have this large portico, colossal Corinthian columns, reminds people of the White House, reminds you of Greek revival architecture in this country, as well as, and Alva, I think, was on record saying that this style in part was inspired by mansions in the South. She was from Mobile, Alabama, of course, and we do see homes with this giant order. And by that I mean these enormous columns that span 2 stories. And here at Marble House, it's not only on the portico, but also, of course, these Corinthian pilasters, which are in the giant order, which span 2 stories of the home. You also have this in Newport, of course, everywhere. So this is the Levi Gale House in downtown Newport, 1835, designed by Russell Warren, a Rhode Island architect. And one wonders, with Marble House, if there was also any nod to Warren to some of these buildings that are here in town. Warren, and I didn't put in any slides of his work, but he built many buildings with giant order columns, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian. It was almost a signature for his buildings, many of which are in Rhode Island. And so we finally get to the Breakers. And we're looking here at the elevation in the Great Hall. And we have these massive classicizing elements. Again, the pilasters, Corinthian pilasters, giant order spanning 2 stories. This home was built on an even larger scale than Marble House. It's 4 times the size of Marble House. And this hall rises 45 feet. This is your main public space, the sort of centerpiece of the home around which everything else is arranged. It's the heart of the home. What I think is interesting, though, if we sort of put these 2 things side by side, Marble House and the Great Hall, it's almost as though with the Breakers, you have Marble House kind of just plopped into the middle of the Great Hall. Seems kind of obvious, it's almost, I don't know that this was conscious. I'm wondering, but it's kind of like, well, we can do better than that. We're just gonna We're going to stick it right in the center of our building. But of course, in the case of the breakers, this is much more ornate. We have all of this gilding, the coffered ceiling. Here you see the putti with the garlands on the top course, which I talked about in the facade of the Biblioteca Marciana. It's again very close. And we have all these different colored marbles and great attention to detail. It is, in effect, gilding the lily, but it makes an even stronger statement, let's say, through that gilding of the Gilded Age. But, these things also look back to classical antiquity, they look back to Greek revival, but they also look back to the Renaissance, let's not forget. So these are Italian Renaissance examples. I just picked a few. This is Leon Battista Alberti's Sant'Andrea in Mantua. Again, you have this giant order, which these pilasters which surround various kinds of archways. You have Palladio in Vicenza. This is the Loggia del Capitaniato, again with a giant order, with round arched openings on the bottom, square openings on the top, not unlike what we see in the Breakers' Great Hall. And also another example is Palazzo Valmarana in Vicenza, again Palladio. So just here, I only put in this slide, we already talked about the first two images, but this tripartite division of the elevation in the Great Hall, again, echoes what's happening on the exterior of the building. So there's harmony between the two, exterior and interior. So contrasting visions. One thing what sort of struck me as I was looking at these spaces, you have and I keep the image here of the Great Hall, which is your heart of the building, very heavily decorated and very big. But when you come into the building, it's a different experience, right? This is the vestibule. And here, we're kind of looking more at 15th century rather than 16th century. Here we have kind of a pared back, more austere type of design, and everything is pale in color. And this is, again, typical of Gilded Age architecture, typical of Beaux-Arts style, where you have a hierarchy of spaces, right? You have certain spaces that are less decorated, that kind of create a balance for the more decorated spaces. And we see that in the breakers in the entryway and in some of the surrounding corridors. But I wanted to draw your attention to this form, which I think you can see it better here, this arch with the circles that are contained within it. And we see it in the vestibule. We also see it in the corridor off the Great Hall. And this is a form that's interesting because Hunt seems to play with it. These are some images of the watercolor room in the Vanderbilt mansion in New York, the expanded version, the 1890s version, where we see Hunt. I think this is Hunt. This is part of he worked under G.B. Post on this expansion. But we see this kind of elongated version of this arch, more of a Queen Anne version of the arch. But this too looks back, of course, at 15th and 16th century Italian examples. We see this here, the old sacristy in Florence, Brunelleschi and Donatello for the decorations, this kind of archway. And in the Pazzi Chapel in Florence, again, 1440s. And here, perhaps more clearly, Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan, this design attributed to Bramante, 1490s, which takes from those earlier Florentine examples. And here on the left, I show you what this building looked like before the restoration was done. It had actually been painted over some of these decorative elements, which were then revealed later in the 19th century as restoration work was done on Santa Maria delle Grazie. And again, here in Vicenza, another Palladio villa. And then just quickly looking at these corridors which surround the Great Hall, how different they are, what a contrast they present to the gilding and heavy decoration of the Great Hall. These are actually very pared back. These are much more reminiscent of, say, 15th century Italian architecture. And I find that's quite interesting to me, how those secondary spaces function against the primary spaces. So I'm going to move on to the library because I don't want to go over time. And here, we saw the library in an earlier talk today. This is actually a very interesting room to me, and I wanted to have more time to delve into it. But it's a very patterned room. It's a very decorative room and very much broken up into compartments. You see that, I think, with all of these, all the gilding, the trim, the molding as it moves around, the ceiling, these compartments, of course, the compartments of the chimney piece, which comes from a French chateau, a period sculptural element in the room. And there we see a detail of it. And here again, this compartmentalization of the walls in this space. And we do know that Hunt, designed this. We have the drawings for this space. This was clearly given a serious amount of attention. What's also interesting about these drawings is the presence of a female figure in the drawings. And the room became a family sitting room. It was a room that the family enjoyed. And I think there could be a reason for that. I have a couple of theories. Some more drawings by the Hunt office. What I'm thinking as I look at a room like that is, what is the inspiration? It's ornate, but it's also, as it's divided into compartments and different kinds of decoration juxtaposed with architectural elements in a certain way. I'm wondering if this could have been inspired by Italian manuscript illumination. And as I was looking more closely, I see many parallels with manuscript design of the 15th and 16th centuries. And so I'm just showing you some of those here to give you an idea of what I mean. The division of the pages in Renaissance manuscript illumination is often, you often have these different elements juxtaposed, archways, roundels, decoration that fills the interstitial spaces between, primary figural elements on a page. And I'm showing you a couple of examples here. I can't prove this, and I know that the Vanderbilts, Cornelius and Alice, were not collectors of manuscripts so much, and I don't know that that's the inspiration, but I see it in some specific ways. Here you see these arabesques or grotteschi, they're sometimes called, juxtaposed with interlaced design here. We have the same thing in manuscripts. This is something that I wanted to, look into more. This preciosity of style that doesn't really, you don't see this often. Even in libraries, this isn't very typical of the Gilded Age in what I've come across. And here again, very florid rinceau or foliate ornament that is juxtaposed with figural medallions. Some of these examples were chosen, because of similarities. I'm not saying this is an exact copy by any means, but I think some of the inspiration could be there. And again, here with the fireplace and the other sculptural elements that are overlapping in the library space, you have that sense of overlapping forms also in manuscript design. So this is merely a theory that I'm proposing, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And I'm just ending right there with another image of putti kind of coming off the side of the page as they sit up above Carl Bitter's sculpture in the breakers. So that's the end. Am I okay on time? Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And just raise your hand, and I will run around with the mic. And please do use the mic so that our friends on Zoom can hear us.
Thank you so much for that illuminating talk. It is interesting how the Italian Renaissance revival is really a revival of a revival of a revival, and that we have sort of this pomace set of elements being used and reused and then imitated. And I've heard that Hunt really presented two alternatives to Cornelius and Alice, and said, well, do you want French or Italian? And they picked, maybe they had spaghetti that night and decided on Italian. And I think there might have been a differentiation among the other brothers' projects so that they didn't want to all be the same. But the kind of connoisseurship that you're talking about was so versatile that I think Hunt's ability to synthesize really brought together his knowledge and the client's desires. And so thank you for bringing that to our attention.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I think he was on record saying, you have to give the client what they want, and he did a marvelous job of that and left a lasting legacy. Anyone else?
One in the back.
That was great. Thank you so much, Sarah. My question, actually, it's more of a comment, like my previous guest here. I think a lot of what we see here is kind of an Italian Gesamtkunstwerk. You see patterns of the type that we see in manuscripts, on walls, on floors. I mean, for me, those round insets that you see on the archway reminds me of an inlaid floor or even inlaid decoration on furniture. So I think that the idea that the manuscript is influencing formats in American Renaissance Revival architecture is a fantastic idea, and I think I would like to see that pursued. But I should also be mindful of all of the interweavings of from fabrics to book bindings to floor inlay. Everything is kind of informing everything else at this period. It's hard to disentangle it.
Absolutely, and all of these mansions are related one to another in Newport. All the architecture is speaking to each other. But Hunt was collecting. He loved to go and see rooms and had many volumes of designs of all different kinds, as you're saying, textiles and furniture and so many things. He was his own encyclopedia. All of these things were moving around in his head. I can't even imagine, the creativity to digest all that and come up with new forms every single time for another client. But you're right. No, all of these people were doing the same thing. They were seeing these things, liking them, collecting them, thinking about them, and reworking them.
I also wanted to commend you on bringing in the publications, the art historical publications that disseminated these images to a wider public. That is an element that I didn't pay attention to, and I think is a really good addition to this conversation. Thanks.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you. That was wonderful. That was great. I've always admired Richard Morris Hunt because of his ability to deal with such difficult personalities. So, and especially such conniving or competitive personalities here in Newport and in New York. What can you tell us about his personality? He had this genius element clearly, but he must have also had a real sense of how to deal with people.
Well, I'm not an expert in Hunt by any means. There are people in this room who could no doubt answer that question much more effectively. But my sense is that he knew his stuff. Now, anyone here can feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But he had a supreme self-confidence, and I think that's probably how he was able to manage difficult clients. And, he wasn't second-guessing himself. At least that's my interpretation. Does that sound right?
And I can speak to that a little bit too. He also surrounded himself in his studies with architects and artists who are notoriously difficult personalities. So I have a feeling that in his exposure and his education, he not only, subconsciously, he was both receiving an education in design, but then also in relationships, because he's not only hybridizing his crew and his designs within his architectural practice with his clients, but also the amount of artists he brings into projects. He really hybridizes for the first time in America this idea that architecture and art need to live together. So a lot of that research actually comes from Catherine Moran, who is our our fellows coordinator. So we're here to answer more questions on Hunt. I should also plug, we have an exhibition opening on him on May 30th upstairs, which is why it's so loud upstairs right now. Apologies, but thank you, Sarah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
For those who weren't here at the beginning, I'm just going to reintroduce myself. I'm Leslie Jones. I'm the Director of Museum Affairs and Chief Curator for the Preservation Society of Newport County. And I'm joined by my friend here, Carrie Shrives. I'm actually going to call her my hero. As many of you know, we did have Remy Renzullo scheduled as interior designer and antiques advisor who is going to be filling this slot, but he is on deadline for a major project he's been working on over several years at Castle Howard in the UK. So I think we should all demand free entry and access to Castle Howard. Remy, you're very missed, but Carrie stepped in as a godsend, and this is all working out so beautifully and perfectly, and you'll find out why. We're going to be talking about the Elms today, which from the image you're seeing on your screen right now, it is, unlike Richard Morris Hunt, influenced by historical precedent. It is a direct copy by Horace Trumbauer of Chateau d'Agnier outside of Paris. But we are looking at the Italian side of the Elms, which from the facade you can't really tell. So I'm joined with Carrie. Carrie Shrives is a senior vice president and senior appraiser at Bottom Skinner. She has over 30 years of experience appraising, cataloging, and selling furniture, decorative art, and fine art from the 17th to the 21st centuries. Another long span of history to be a specialist. Carrie has been a frequent contributor to Antiques Roadshow and has provided commentary on the antiques and art market for print and digital news channels, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, CNN, ABC, Bloomberg, and The Guardian. She is a certified member of the Appraisers Association of America and maintains current requirements for the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice. Carrie has handled such significant property as the rediscovery and sale of Fitzhugh Lane's Sunset at Gloucester Harbor. It sold for a world record $3.3 million, the highest ever obtained for that artist. She also has broad experience with single-owner sales, including the Solomon collection of Judaica, which brought $1.5 million, and her focus on the intersection of antiques and technology, which we will be touching on today, drove the successful transformation of Skinner into a digital business. As a generalist appraiser, she assists clients by providing appraisal reports for estate tax, financial planning, and equitable distribution and insurance purposes. If you need Carrie's number, just come and see her after the talk. So, before we begin, since we're in Newport, Carrie actually shared with me yesterday that her first auction experience was in Newport as a young, hot auctioneer on the trail. So Carrie, do you want to just fill us in a little bit on your interaction with Newport?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me here today in the Preservation Society, and it's been fabulous to hear the other speakers that we'll really be following up on a lot of what has been said earlier and tying it together. But my first experience, I had just come on as a full-time cataloger in the European Furniture and Decorative Arts Department. I appeared on site and the office was empty, only to find that there was this on-site auction happening in Newport. So I begged and borrowed my way and hopped in the car, and we were selling the Orchard at the time. This was 1989. Contents of this 1870s, again, a chateau that was sort of French, but based on a Swiss design. I wish it was Italian. That would have really come full circle. But it was the case. And it really, auctions are a fabulous thing, and on-site auctions in particular. I think there's nothing like the allure for neighbors to sort of get behind the curtain, see what's there. We can talk a little bit more about just what it means to have something owned by somebody and to know it. And that really was sort of a key point in sort of cementing for me why auctions are such a fabulous thing.
Absolutely, and we'll be talking specifically at the Elms about a significant auction. So in 1962, after the passing of Julia Berwind, the last private owner of the Elms, the entire contents of the house was put up for sale at an on-site auction. We have several houses as a part of our our collection that have had these on-site sales when the last living family member passes away. And the Elms was so unique in the way that it was cataloged. Park Bernay chose to catalog it by room. So there was a full inventory of what was left in each room, which has been for us sort of a Rosetta Stone of piecing this house back together. Other places like Chateau-sur-Mer, we were not so lucky. It was all cataloged by type. So we had no idea where anything went as we've been re-examining that house. But this is also another part of the resources that we've used to help build back from that 1962 auction is photography. The Elms was widely photographed when it was first finished in 1901, and this shows the interior of the dining room in 1902, designed by Jules Lallau in collaboration with Horace Trumbauer. This is the same room in 2024. I think we've done a pretty good job reassembling the house, considering the fact that most of the pieces, with the exception of the large-scale historical paintings, were removed from this room, this interior. Let me just keep track of my notes here as we move through. So this is another angle of the dining room. And as you can tell, Allard was trying to use an Italian influence in the way that he created furniture, the architecture, of course, as well as the use of textiles, and also, of course, the paintings, which I'm going to get to shortly. But if you were a guest of the Berwinds and didn't quite get it yet, you just had to look up and see the St. Mark's Lion and the St. Mark's Cross. There was also a use of composite stone and marble sourced from Italy, and the doors that you see here on the left are very heavily inspired by Venetian palazzi interior framework and moldings. So we've actually found several examples that specifically reference this. But what's most interesting is that Allard, as we've also discovered through a lot of recent research, and also through the great work of our curator emeritus, Paul Miller, who's an expert on Jules Lallau, is that Allard was picking from existing historical spaces. And this is the least impressive of the Venetian palazzi, but it's Ca Cornet. And from this, Allard actually sourced a series of the historical paintings and all the overdoor paintings that are at the Elms. This is a terrible image, but it's the result of scholarship being digitized. Priscilla Bright, who's actually one of our research fellows, found this, and it shows two of the paintings in their original context at Ca Cornet, and now they're actually at the Elms. So I'm going to focus particularly here from the auction perspective on the paintings that left in 1962. So the 6 overdoor paintings were all removed and sold as individual lots. And as you can tell, they left a huge void in the space. The larger historical scene paintings were left on the walls to be demolished with the house. And that's when the Preservation Society stepped in. And the incredible women and men who supported this organization were able to cobble together funds to buy the house and save the material. And many of the people who actually attended the auction gifted things back immediately, such as Doris Duke, who had actually purchased the beautiful Chinese and Allard created Chinese-inspired paneling in the morning room. Doris Duke was planning to take those out of the house, but they never left because of the actions of the Preservation Society and her close relationship with many of our founders.
And the larger paintings were actually glued in place, is that right?
Yes, so if they came off, they'd be torn. So it's, I guess, making that distinction as to what's worth maintaining. So of these, we were able to, starting in the early 21st century, start to piece together the plan to bring them back to the Preservation Society. So in 2004, we were able to get the top left painting by Lazzarini, the bottom left Molinari, and actually all the Lazzarini and Molinari and the Karl Loth. So Karl Loth is the bottom right, the Lazzarini is center right lower, and Molinari center right or center left lower. The two Sebastiano Ricci paintings that are in the middle on the top and on the right on the top evaded us. They were owned by a separate separate dealer, Wildenstein & Co., and they were not willing to sell them to us for for the price we could afford as a nonprofit. And it is one of our previous curators and directors who was actually at a bus stop and ran into the gallery owner and was like, "Give me a break, man. We need these paintings back. You're never going to sell them. Will you please cut me a deal?" And so I think they finally realized that this was the right place for them to go. So they were able to return to our collection and be reinstalled in 2014. So that was a very exciting year. 2012. That was a very exciting year for us. And we're going to turn, we're missing a slide. There's out of order. So we're going to turn to the library now. And there's lots that are still missing from the Elms auction, but in particular, these two places we've been able to recover some items. And I wanted to throw it back to you, Carrie, now that I've sort of set the stage for objects that have left and how they've returned in various ways. When you're approaching auctions, or at least sourcing items too, what are the tools that you use in your toolkit in terms of defining material, in terms of declaring provenance? And so if somebody was to come and find objects from these historic houses, what are the things that you use to help in sales or identification or bring them to people that might be interested in buying them?
Well, I think as Catherine sort of so aptly put, AI is not coming for us.
Hope not.
I think there are a lot of tools that I think we're able to use now that weren't available at the time. So I think, the Elms, the catalog itself was very well illustrated, but most auction printed catalogs of the period, maybe 10% of items were photographed. Mm-hmm. So you're relying on descriptions without any, there's no standard for describing items. Different specialists within the same auction house will describe things differently. Over time, descriptions change. So a lot of what you really need is connoisseurship to be able to look at a previous description and be able to parse together whether it's the same piece that you're looking at. Mm-hmm. And we are all relying on a lot of past information to use. And the provenance, I think, in the current market, again, I've been doing this for a while, I think people are becoming more aware of the significance of it. There have been a lot of sort of celebrity sales and sales built around people's choices and their style, and the names associated with it have become more significant, which I think is in turn making people think more about where things they have came from and trying to document. Mm-hmm. And that, those pieces need to come together in a timely and meaningful way to be able to find, because you've got a ticking clock, right? Don't you, in a way? Items come to the market and they resurface, they mm-hmm. surface and resurface very, very quickly, and you don't have a lot of time.
And well, that's a fair point, even going back to the overdoor panels at the Elms. They had come up at auction a few times and never sold. So that was actually to our benefit, that I think that everybody here was probably holding their breath, hoping that they wouldn't sell or they would be sold to somebody who'd be so generous as to gift them back to the institution. But as you're saying too, we have seen quite a few things from this sale come up at auction, in some cases with also estimates that are far beyond our reach as an institution. So it is always sort of sitting on the edge of your seat from a museum perspective and being ready, because auctions don't give you months to prepare, to fundraise. You have a few weeks to identify the fact that it will be a part of the sale, look at the estimate, use your best judgment from a fundraising perspective what you might actually need, and then build that program to hopefully achieve success, which doesn't always happen.
Well, and I think auction houses are realizing that more to an extent now, and are giving institutions advance warning. I think, because they realize, I think there's a realization that there are certain items that belong in certain places if you can make it happen. Yeah.
And so from a documenting perspective, this is another angle of the library, again from 1902. And this also gives a nice perspective on the initial collecting habits of Berwind as he built the Elms. One of the unique things about the houses in the Gilded Age as well, particularly in Newport, this house was finished in 1901. It was fully furnished and outfitted with antiques in order to be able to present these spaces to peers or hopeful peers within society. So Berwind, working with Horace Trumbauer as the architect, brings in Jules Allard, as I mentioned, who also did the interiors of this house and the breakers and Marble House. Allard actually creates a plan to completely outfit this space and chooses Venetian and Renaissance Italian artwork. We think it's because Hermione Berwind, Hermione Torrey, as her maiden name, Edward's wife, was born in Italy to American parents, but her father was an American diplomat as well as an artist and the owner of one of the most heavily produced quarries of marble in Carrara. So there could be that sort of connection there. We also understand that, again, Edward and Hermione met in Italy, but there are also a lot of sales going on in the 1890s. And Allard is probably the one going and doing the acquisition of these pieces. Somebody had, I think it was actually Nat that had mentioned earlier, Émile Gavet. Well, these two pieces that are in this space, so you have the tondo of the Virgin and Child, and then they're both Della Robbia, TBD. They may or may not be Della Robbia or of the school of Della Robbia. These both came from the Gavet collection, but they were acquired through Jules Allard. Just go back to the PowerPoint here, and I'll see if I'm as sly as Sarah with a laser pointer. But you can see right here is the Della Robbia plaque, and here again is that Della Robbia inset. And I had included this image because the image on the right, that Della Robbia roundel, that is Émile Gavet's apartment in Paris. So thank God for photography because we've been able to source it to that space. But we've been talking too in previous lectures today, and we've been discussing this too, again, about how provenance is so important. And Berwind wanted to be a great collector. He never ascended to the same echelons as his Henry Clay Frick, who was a peer of his, or J.P. Morgan, who was a business partner of his. He's not actually that well known as a collector, but if you go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and you type in Berwind in their collections search engine, there's a lot of really significant French artwork and Italian ceramics that were donated from the Elms to the Met. So Berwind is a prolific collector. Sometimes he's maybe steered in that direction. It's not his innate sensibilities. But do you want to speak a little bit to provenance too, especially this type of multiple provenance, a famous Parisian collector and a Newport mansion?
But still the question about who
done
they're by. Yes. And that again is, these photographs of the material in situ are just invaluable.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I think that's where I think technology can help assist as far as, I know, the Frick was very early in the process of digitizing their collection and adding metadata so that other institutions and researchers could use what they have.
Mm-hmm.
And as more and more of this becomes available, be able to tie these pieces together. But where you have, you have this sort of these double and triple layered provenances, that becomes really significant.
Mm-hmm.
And it, I think behooves everyone to try to put those pieces together.
Mm-hmm.
Gavet, what's fascinating is that here it is in his apartment. We know he had an incredible business in providing, I think the quantities that you said that
the
he
amount
provided.
of Della Robbias he sent to the U.S. was astonishing.
Yeah, and that's, I think that is that's fascinating in itself, of how his reputation in the period as a dealer amongst the group of people who were his target collector base, how we activated them.
Right.
Yeah.
And sort of branching off of what Catherine had mentioned before too, Gilded Age then, Gilded Age now. Where do we see this type of material, with or without provenance, in the market?
I think it's these niche markets are coming back. I mean, I think if the term brown furniture, I think will make everybody groans when they hear it.
Not me, it makes me smile.
But there are these niches where, I think the reality is, there are a lot of similarities. We've talked about, Catherine certainly pinned between the Gilded Age and where we are now. There has been a lot of sameness in decorating styles and minimalism that is, we're seeing that change. There's sort of this maximalist interest. You look at the results of the Anne and Paul Getty auctions, really a rich taste. It was certainly Italian furniture and decorative objects and textiles offered that met with great success. There are these, there's sort of this interest in having some distinction. I think where you find in the Gilded Age, it was the collectors were working on the advice of their advisors. They were trying to emulate and give the impression that they were something that they were not. They didn't grow up with this wealth. They didn't inherit the wealth. They created it themselves, but they wanted it to look to the world like it had always been there. So they were making these sort of layered interiors. What you have now, I think, are more people who are confident in their own choices, and they're buying what they like for what they like. They're not buying it in quantities. They don't have the size houses to fill. But it is, I think there is a lot of hope.
Certainly, I know that I'm not part of Gen Z, but I know there's the Gen Z old money aesthetic, so maybe that will help the market here escalate a little bit.
And also, every single piece of this, no matter how quickly Jules Allard produced these furnishings, you think about the pace that they were knocked out at the time. The quality, you can't replace it. And I think the storytelling is all of our responsibility to, provide that storytelling content that makes future generations want to care about these items. And that's where the, provenance comes in, being able to tie it together with what you see, television programs, whether you love them or not. They will open it to a wider audience.
It is cyclical, thinking about, as Nat was discussing, as well as Catherine, this sort of resurgence of interest in historical types of art collecting. And I think that there is a hope that will also happen again. The idea of contemporary art being, in many cases, or at least generalized in the market, looking at as more of collecting for investment. I feel like as though in this day and age, people are looking at historical art, not so much for the investment, but as you were saying, more so for the love of being around it on a daily basis.
But it also, there's value, it's retaining value. You're not, it's not potentially going to exponentially increase, but the reality is when you buy art, that might not happen anyway, so you need to buy what you love.
Yeah. And if you can't afford to buy it, just come to the Newport mansions and surround yourself on it.
Look at it in other people's houses. Yeah. But, I think the cyclical, again, you think about, the time period, by the time the auction happened in 1962, tastes had moved on.
Yes.
And I think it would be very interesting to see, for what of who the buyers or the serious buyers were. Were they buying for institutions? Ultimately, at that point, the interest in sort of the colonial revival, John D. Rockefeller, Henry Francis DuPont, Henry Ford were creating, they had sort of the tail of their interest in reviving sort of American 18th century. We're seeing that has passed in its latest iteration in the early 2000s, so this is coming back.
Yeah, it's one of the tricky parts of documentation, which is what our final slide is about. Like I said, there's a wonderful catalog created by Park Bernay that is cataloging all the contents of the Elms that remain, at least by room, but there are no notes in the margins that we know of. We have maybe 4 or 5 copies of that particular catalog with some detail about what things sold for, but we don't know who purchased them, with the exception of what is returned. So thank you to those who have gifted those materials back to us. But they range from geographic location. Some people drove in for hours to come to this sale. Some people bought very locally. So we are still trying to pull all of those things together. But from a provenance standpoint, we are lucky from a technology perspective to have digitized historical documentation through a variety of different repositories. So Historic New England on the left, top left, for example, has a great scanned document of the Torrey marble works, which was in Boston. Again, the Torrey family was Hermione Berwind's father. We knew about the Emile Gavet material through the Jules material that we've discovered. And then we've also come to find out recently that Blakesley Galleries was a tremendous provider of, they were advisors and dealers for the Berwinds. We only found that out because of Blakesley's obituary. It doesn't exist anywhere else, but his obituary was published and listed all of his clients, and Berwind was one of them. Blakesley sold both French and Italian art, so it's possible that Berwind's French collection comes from Blakesley, but also his Italian. And then one of my favorite discoveries, Eve Loftus, who's our research assistant, found René Gimpel's diaries at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And René Gimpel was a Parisian art dealer, and he writes at length about Berwind. And I'm just going to share a few of those diary entries with you today, because they're quite fascinating. And these are direct quotes. He is a handsome old American with white hair and a stiff mustache who, despite his elegance, can't abide dandyism. The interior of his mansion is bric-a-brac. Almost everything is fake. Because he believes he has taste, he has never asked anyone's advice, and he is too violent and authoritarian to stand the truth. He would possess nothing if it had not met me, except two large and superb bouchers. So, God bless digitization. We're going to keep on time because we also have lunch after this, so we're going to stop here, and we'll be happy to take any questions.
So there's no record of the buyers from that sale? I mean, Park Burnett didn't...
Well,
I've asked.
There has to be. And at the time, it was so common to people to pencil into the margins who the buyers of various items were. There needs to be a call for people, old catalogs.
But you'd also think the firm would have in their files.
So we've reached out to Sotheby's, and we have wonderful colleagues who work there, and unfortunately they can't find records of this sale, or they have not been able to locate them yet. And likewise, the Park Burnett catalog from Chateau-sur-Mer. We also want to know who bought that material, so if anybody knows.
There's got to be annotated catalogs somewhere. Keep looking.
Yes.
They exist.
The bowels of eBay.
They exist. And that's, again, I think digitization is key.
Yeah.
Hello, thanks for stepping in, Carrie. I have a somewhat related question here about Italian Renaissance art and decoration. Because as an auction house, because you now use auction platforms like live auctioneers, et cetera, the world is your market. So what is the market for the Italian Renaissance, and where is it going in the world?
I think the best of Italian goes back to Italy.
Good.
I think you're seeing again what globalization, where for Bonhams, for sort of the a higher value material, about 40% of it crosses an ocean. So it's it's sort of going to and fro. I think certainly in New England, again alluded to earlier, there were a lot of really sort of cultured, well-traveled families that did go on the Grand Tour. They visited Italy, whether they were buying genuine antiques or pastiches, they were bringing them back. And there's quite a bit in this area. It doesn't tend to stay in the area.
I think we've also found out, too, from a Gilded Age perspective, what was sold as Renaissance now might not be considered Renaissance. It might be considered a very nice copy, which unfortunately, all of these dealers, including Bernard Berenson and Joseph and Joel Duveen, unfortunately become known for. So it's what is actually authentic is, again, probably going across the seas again.
Yeah, they were very good businessmen.
Hi, Leslie.
Hi, Jamie.
My question is, how much of the Elms collection has actually returned to us?
From a percentage, I think we probably look at, we're well under 50%. When you visit the Elms, it is fully furnished. And that is in large part due to the initial individuals who helped with the acquisition of the property and loaning and gifting their own private property from here in Newport and New York to open the house. When we acquired the building and saved it from demolition, there were a number of Newport families that gave whole rooms of furniture so that we could open our doors and start making revenue through ticket sales to fix up the house. So when you go in today, you'll see a variety of bedrooms that are fully furnished, but they're not even close to what the original furnishings were like. They're different styles. It is sort of a patchwork of Newport, but it's a great case study in that sense too, as to how we're able to maintain these sites. We even have furniture from Jules Lallard's family that was gifted to us many years ago. It doesn't belong at the Elms, but it's amazing to have, and the room was empty, so, great. Recently, we have had original bedroom furniture of Mr. Berwind return from a very generous donor based out of Aspen, Colorado. Somehow Berwind's furniture made it all the way to Colorado. So, one more question?
Yes, I love the elms, the beautiful grounds, the building itself. What about the portrait of Mr. Berwind that you first see in one of the first rooms on the main floor? He appears that he probably was holding a cigar in his hand, but the cigar has been removed from this painting. Does everybody know this portrait of Mr. Berwind?
It's actually the portrait of Jules Lallard.
Oh, that's Jules Lallard. Well, he's holding his hand in such a position. Something is missing.
Like this.
And I wondered, who took out that part of the painting? Could you just write a little label? Let's have more labels. So, anybody else for more labels in the mansion?
Very good question, Mary. Thank you. So that painting, also donated by members of the Allau family, we actually had it X-rayed to determine, because we thought maybe it could be a claret glass, it could be a writing utensil, a drawing utensil, it could be a cigar. There's nothing. It's just an awkward hand pose. So maybe it was a signature of Lallard. Maybe he had arthritis. I don't know. But it's a little, it leaves you wondering. And that may also be the mystique of it. Maybe it was left to leave you wondering, because there's a lot we wonder about Jules Lallard. Good question, though. Okay, I think we're going to welcome everybody to lunch, and we'll come back for our final presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all had a good morning and enjoyed your lunch. I'm Lydia Kimball. I'm on the Symposium Committee, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Charles Bimbaum, President and CEO of the Cultural Landscape Foundation. He has an amazing bio. Prior to serving as the Cultural Landscape Foundation President and CEO, Charles spent 15 years with the National Park Service and a decade in private practice in New York. Birnbaum was a Loeb Fellow at Harvard's Graduate School of Design and a Rome Prize recipient. He was awarded American Society of Landscape Architects La Grace Medal, the President's Medal, and the ASALA Medal, and the Olmsted Medal. Maybe you could do one more. He served as a lecturer in landscape architecture at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. He's a visiting professor at Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture and a Glimcher Distinguished Professor at Ohio State University. In 2021, the Cultural Landscape Foundation unveiled the Oberlander International Prize in Landscape Architecture, a permanently endowed prize with a $100,000 purse. Charles will be speaking today on the influence of the Italian villa landscape on garden design and landscape preservation in America. Charles.
Good afternoon. It's always troublesome to follow chocolate brownies. It's great to be here. It's great to be back in Newport. And it's great to open the windows and talk about landscape. I think if it's possible for landscape to be the elephant in the room, I think it certainly has been this morning. And so what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about context, being both physical and historical. First, I'll begin by looking at sort of first in terms of my own story. As a quest, I live in Washington, D.C., and my hope is that all of us will seek out the Italian influence wherever we are when we're also not here. You cannot throw a stone in Washington without confronting the Italian design influence. Whether it's the John Russell Pope Jefferson Memorial and its homage, if you will, to Palladian villas, the Great Macmillan Commission, the Senate Commission plans, also, they sent their teams abroad, curated by a group of architects and landscape architects that included Daniel Burnham, Charles McKim, Frederick Olmsted Jr., and Augustus St. Gaudens. When their trip was curated, Olmsted Jr. had a role in which Italian gardens in Rome and beyond that they would visit to take back for ideas for how to detail the monumental core. And if we come a little closer to Newport and we look out of our rear view or side view mirrors, we'll also see that the folks that were going on those travels abroad were also influencing the shared environment of what is very much part of the civic landscape of Newport today. One of my favorite stories of resurrection is the incredible magic that Mrs. Hamilton did to resurrect the Blue Garden. Now, all of this is happening at the turn of the last century. We've been talking about the Gilded Age, and specifically, I'd like to look at it through the lens of landscape and landscape architecture. The American Society of Landscape Architects was founded in 1899. There were 10 founding members. Only one was a woman, Beatrix Farrand of great fame at Dumbarton Oaks, and the niece of Edith Wharton. And then there was only one person that came from west of the Mississippi, O.C. Simons. Ferruccio Vitali, who was part of the early seminal days, both at the ASLA, but also was a consulting landscape architect to McKim, Mead & White when they built their villa on the hill for the American Academy in Rome. He is represented in Washington, D.C. at the original National Gallery building, and for me, one of my favorite moments, this is happening right now, is when the wisteria starts to bloom on the wall that is now draping Ferruccio Vitali's design. What I like here is this notion of Vitali's comment. This is out of a conversation ASLA had 6 years after its founding on Italian gardens. And Vitali says, rather than copy Italian gardens as a whole or in detail, we should draw a lesson from them, an inspiration, trying to conceive something of its own rather than copying or patching up copied details, believing that an inspiration will readily come to him who stops thinking business and thinks art, and finally getting acquainted. Beatrix Farrand attended that same meeting, noting, this is Dumbarton Oaks, people copy details, not the grand idea, and think they have a garden. The Italian garden is homogeneous. We are apt to go to extremes in one detail. Seclusion is typical of Italian gardens. In English gardens, the flowers are the important thing. In Italian, the layout. John Charles Olmsted, the nephew and stepson of Olmsted Sr., again, one of the founding members of ASLA, says Italian gardens in America should be called formal gardens. He feels very strongly about this. When we actually look at the plans by the Olmsted office, this is not in John Charles Olmsted's hand, but you'll notice that for the Blue Garden, the Curtis Garden, it is called a formal garden. It is not called an Italian garden. Downing Vaux, the son of Calvert Vaux, named as a memorial, if you will, to the great man who died in 1852, says, the need for the formal garden is so universal in America that the near future is going to see a great demand. So that's the professional society at its origins. Then we have the Senate Commission. This is the Charles Moore Plan of Washington, D.C. of 1902. And believe it or not, the frontispiece of this publication is this view from Villa Medici in Rome. And the Villa Medici, of course, the fountain is aligned with the Vatican Dome. It's also a cantilevered terrace. And the reason I'm showing you the Brooklyn Promenade, oddly next to that, which is from the 1950s, is Michael Rapuano, who has the Rome Prize from 1922 to 1924, documents the Villa Medici, sees the cantilevered terrace, and what does he do? 25 years later, he creates a cantilevered promenade with a panoramic view to Manhattan. You'll also see out of this plan that that fountain is recreated on axis with the Washington Monument in Meridian Hill Park, a great Italianate design, and also the first use of embedded aggregate concrete in America in a public landscape. And then what we start to see is the exporting. Rome Prize fellows start going to Rome for 3 years, remarkably, initially. This is the first drawings of the very first fellow. This is Mr. Lawson's drawings of the Villa Medici fountain. By the 1930s, we still have the fountain being copied and documented. This is the work of James Lister, whose imprimatur on the city of Cleveland is significant. And then we have another fellow named Stuart Mertz, who I know very little about. I've always wondered if it's the son of Fred and Ethel. That was just a test to see if you were with me after lunch. It's really cheap. I can tell you a little bit about Mertz, but we'll save that for another time. But it's amazing to me how this notion of copying is so central to landscape architecture during this period. You can go to Union Station in Washington. You can go to the Freer, and we'll come back to Mr. Charles Platt momentarily. You can go to the National Gallery. You could go to the West Coast and the work of Florence Yock and Lucille Council, who were great landscape architects. They were also set designers that did the sets for Gone with the Wind and for Romeo and Juliet, among other films. And here we have not only the Villa Medici fountain, but we're borrowing this wonderful framed gateway at Villa Vicobello, and we're putting them together. And we have another later fellow drawing the same things in 1936, Morris Trotter. And then finally, if you find yourself in Montecito, the property is called Il Brolino, and it is open to the public today by visitation. And then finally, when we think about modernism and the great Tommy Church and the famous first kidney-shaped swimming pool, when he's first a Harvard student, he's looking at Italian gardens and how they would translate to California. And here again at Austin Valverde's estate in Montecito, we see the same exact fountain recreated by Lockwood DeForest. So it really is in the water at this point. So one of my favorite translations, and it seemed a perfect homage today to talk about the Fontana delle Tortugas in Rome. Here's Philip Schutze's drawings. He was the architect of Swan House, for those of you that know that property in Atlanta. We have Robert Kitchen, who became a landscape architect at SOM. And then we have it at George Booth, the patron of Cranbrook, at his estate, which had a arts and crafts English house with an Italian garden. We have it at the Ringling estate, which we saw earlier today. And then a little closer to home, we have it at the Elms. So what we see here is this kind of carbon copy treatment of these landscape features, these borrowing, in the same way that people are collecting. And then finally, the fleur-de-lis fountain at the Villa of Pamphili, which was based on an original model by Bernini, which did not stand the test of time. It has been reconstructed, or I should say restored. This is a new version of that today. And we could go as far north as Seaside Park and Bar Harbor, Maine, to see another replica. So with that as kind of a prelude, what I'd like to spend the rest of my time doing is first broadening the lens on who those tastemakers were, then how the torch was carried to the discipline of landscape architecture, what are some of the commonalities and guiding principles in these gardens, and then, to be candid with everyone, I was searching for a conclusion to all of this as a way forward. And so I'll look at a few different examples of work that has happened, work that can be done, and how to perhaps view this situation going forward. So first, the tastemakers. Guy Lowell, Edith Wharton, Rose Standish Nichols, Charles Platt, the Puckish man himself, I'm Maxfield Parrish, and then finally John Singer Sargent. So in terms of the tastemakers, artists and authors such as Platt, Wharton, and Parrish saw Italian villas as sources of inspiration for the country houses that their affluent countrymen were building the North Shore of Long Island, the Berkshires in Massachusetts, and of course here. How many people here are familiar with Italian Gardens, the Platt book, just out of curiosity? So in landscape and just for those of you that didn't scan the room, it was only a few hands that went up. And in landscape architecture, the whole taste-making of Italian gardens all starts with Platt. And what's interesting to me about Platt's work is, like Gertrude Jekyll, through photography or from his manipulation of photography, that we're not only exploring the gardens and what makes an Italian garden, but we're also looking at this notion of patina and antiquity, that this is a garden that has been a witness to layers of history. For Platt, it all begins at Faulkner Farm, and to a lesser degree at Weld, the Lars and Isabel Anderson estate. When Charles Platt's book is reviewed in Italian Gardens, they note, of Italian Gardens in Garden and Forest publication, it says, "We cannot help feeling that much of the interest which invests these pictures in the originals is derived from the fact that they are in a measure ruined, and therefore appeal to the reverential sentiment which thoughtful minds always feel in the presence of works which have come down to them from the past." This is, of course, the plan for Faulkner Farm. Both Platt, Shipman, Ferrand understood that these were garden rooms, that this was a place for self-reflection where you could be in a group of people or be by yourself. Faulkner Farm went viral. If Instagram would have existed then, in fact, I actually was looking for Faulkner Farm on Instagram and preparing for today. It was just in every single shelter magazine, popular magazine, book publication. This was Guy Lowell's survey, which I'll come back to, American Gardens. Here's the plate for that. And what's really interesting is when you look at the plan for Faulkner Farm that on the right now turned the opposite direction, I have this next to the Villa Gambaraia at Settignano. And you can see that both of these gardens are so similar, the strong axial relationships, the very compartmentalized garden room with water features, the peristyle at the end of the axis. So it's very much the same, dealing with steep hillside, extending the building architecture out into the landscape, into walls, steps, gazebos, etc., as a way to navigate the site. And I wanted to show this not just because I think it's where it all begins with gardens, but also to put Sprague alongside of the Vanderbilts. I mean, Sprague, when he purchased the garden, he was worth $7 million back then. He had a special train of 9 cars to carry his antiquities and household goods to the property. And Italian villa owners such as Charles Sprague saw themselves as the successors of the Italian princes of the Renaissance, the collectors of artworks commissioned by the Medici. So this is a theme we've seen today. We see both newly manufactured and antiquity moving out to the garden. And we also see, again, you can see how similar this is to the Gambaraia plan, uniformly praised and published extensively. Faulkner Farm not only established Platt's career as a tastemaker of both house and garden, but his newly conceived Italian-inspired design, rich in arts and crafts plantsmanship, gave rise to other such places, richly infused with historical themes and associations. So the same period that we have Platt, a couple of years later, we have Edith Wharton, 1904, publishing Italian Villas. And I love that Wharton refers to this as a cult. This truly is a cult of people that are importing. Wharton also is celebrating and drawing attention to this rich patina and this antiquity that exists. And then she leads by example, creating her own garden at the Mount from 1902 to 1911 with assistance from her niece, Beatrix Ferrand. And the results here is a New England garden in an Italian manner. And as I alluded to earlier, Ferrand advocated that the garden should be architectural compositions divided into rooms. It seems that every time I come here, I don't know if that the society previously only had conferences in the spring, But this notion of garden magic that that Wharton referred to, always seems to be present here. And from the formal drives, the forecourt and parterres of the breakers, American landscape architecture evolved during the country place era through Platt and Wharton, who would define it not only as elements of the Italian landscape, and I think this is really important, the notion of atmosphere. When we pulled up this morning and you're looking out at the ocean and you can see that misty quality of the house looming from within, I can't help but think about how absolutely perfect the notion of working with Parrish to capture this notion of atmosphere to convey Wharton's writings. I would say that, I come from the world of historic preservation as much as I do landscape architecture. And when the Park Service looks at places such as the Elms, such as Biltmore, such as Marble House, they look at what's called the 7 aspects of integrity. The sixth and seventh aspect is feeling and association. And so as we begin to place a value on the Italian villa landscape today, I can't help but think about this notion of atmosphere or garden magic, to use Wharton's terms, and what that means in terms of how we convey significance and integrity of place today. One of the things that was noted in Mac Griswold and Eleanor Weller's book on the Golden Age of American Gardens, which really is about this Gilded Age era, they note, taken together, Wharton, Platt, and Parrish all recognized that American gardens were smitten with the idea of background. For their gardens, as for their houses, they invented their backgrounds with the carte blanche lent them by the stylistic eclecticism of the day. Griswold and Weller go on to say that having a great garden was as important as a box at the opera or a string of polo ponies. It was just part of what was expected at that time. Now, I mentioned Guy Lowell earlier, a name probably not familiar to most here. Guy Lowell was the chairman of the first landscape architecture program at MIT, which was a year before Harvard. It was 1899. And unlike Harvard, it accepted women in 1899. And so that's sort of, it doesn't exist in the same capacity any longer. But Lowell believed that the American landscape architecture would take the best of European traditions and evolve a discipline catering to the wide-ranging needs of the United States. His first book was so successful, and here's an example at the back of the book where it has little thumbnails. So for example, Masslands in Cornish, New Hampshire was the work of Rose Standish Nichols, who was mentored by Platt and by Lowell. And here she is in her first garden, Masslands, which is in the Cornish colony. So we have a lot of cross-pollination happening with people like St. Gaudens and others who are, and Ellen Shipman, moving between the Cornish colonies and doing work here. His follow-up book, Small Italian Villas and Farmhouses, published in 1916, republished in 1922. I just want to show you on the right-hand side the views of Caparola. Here is Caparola in recent years on the right. 1 year after this book was published, Mrs. Oakley Thorne, who is the president of the Garden Club in Santa Barbara and Montecito, commissions a house and a garden that is inspired by Caparola, which appeared the year earlier in Lowell's book. And this, for those of you that may winter in Palm Beach, this style continues to play out up until the 1930s. I just wanted to give a shout out to Rose Standish Nichols. I would say that her writings are more about capturing the quality and spirit of these gardens. She notes, to those travelers who are weary of cities and who love both art and nature, I can recommend these gardens as a joy to the eye and a balm to the soul. And she designs gardens in Lake Forest. I don't know of anything she did here per se, but again, advancing this tradition and carrying it forward. And I would be remiss not to show the work of John Singer Sargent as well. And I think it's interesting because we have sort of touched on him sort of tangentially today. And we can see the kind of work that he's doing of Italian villa landscapes. I mentioned Charles Platt earlier. Charles Platt helps curate a visit for him abroad. For Charles Freer, of course, of the Freer Museum, This painting is in their permanent collection, Breakfast in the Loggia. The friar is designed by Charles Platt. And so once again, we see this kind of movement between the allied arts. And then finally, James Deering at Vizcaya hires Sargent. He comes and stays and does these paintings. And just a little bit of trivia here, if you know Vizcaya, the person who, this was his career work in terms of landscape architecture, Diego Suarez, was stolen by Mr. Deering from Harold Acton at Itati. So he was the person working for Bernard Berenson at Itati, and then he's brought to Vizcaya to work with Paul Chauffin, the architect. And then, of course, all of this sort of patina, this atmosphere, is captured by Sargent. And then lastly, another Sargent painting on the bottom right. I showed you all earlier a view of the fountain at Valverde. This is the gateway that is behind it, and there is that atmosphere that you get in that California light and the live oak trees casting and animating their shadows against that. So that's kind of what's happening in the popular culture at that time, if you will, for those that want to read about Italian gardens. Now what I want to do is just look at, for a moment, at academia. The profession of landscape architecture, again, is starting the same year as the American Society of Landscape Architects, 1899. This is the McKimmead White building. Vitali did the landscape. There's also a central courtyard that you can't see here. And these are some photos that I found at the American Academy on the top left and right. This is a first class of fellows, including Lawson and Schutze. I couldn't help but show these next to the old King Cole mural in the Knickerbocker Hotel in New York City, as well as a ladies' home journal from that period. But as a way to introduce these gardens to students, so there are no slide projectors then. So these are the original cards from Harvard's collections where they taught students, for example, here about the water table at Villalante. The first textbook within the discipline is by Hubbard and Kimball in 1917, and you can see here we have the Cypress Alley at Gombaraya. We then have importing from Great Britain in 25, Shepard and Jellicoe's key book to showing us how these gardens have been documented in plans. So the first book in the English language, and you get a little sense of a Farnese typical plan and section, or the Villa Torlonia, which no longer exists. This was bombed during, or not to this degree, it was bombed during the Second World War. And then you have the measure drawings. And I believe that the measure drawings are really key, and this gets back to this sort of place in the road where there are those that copy and those that create art. That this act of drawing for 3 years and taking your time and measuring a garden in great detail, I believe taught landscape architects how to value and see history and culture in a way that it was outside of the discipline at that time. This is the first fellow, Mr. Lawson. He is standing at Villa Madama. This is in the archives at Cornell. And if you are there today, the studios in 100 years haven't changed. And there's no air conditioning. The tiled floors are very cool. There are shutters. And except for maybe sweltering July, it's a very habitable place to be. But you can see how the students are doing measure drawings. This is Villa Caparola in a model by Ralph Griswold, the second fellow. If you know Point State Park in Pittsburgh or Chatham Village, those were places Griswold designed after the academy. This is the Norman Newton, who taught at Harvard for many decades. I'm standing on a table. These drawings are about 12 feet across. They're almost impossible to capture. He documented garden theaters, among other things, the Villa Medici. Lawson's collections are at Cornell, and you can see the measure drawings that he was doing. I'll come back to this site in a moment. We have Villa Corsi Salviette, Petraia. You see the drawings. This, again, is teaching these young students how to see Italian villa landscapes. I mentioned Michael Rapuano, Clark and Rapuano for the New Yorkers here, all of the parkways, Jones Beach. We've all heard about the Power Broker and Robert Moses. When people say that's a Robert Moses landscape, he didn't design it, he was the client. And so we have, of course, the work of Clark and Rapuano. Michael Rapuano was a student at Cornell, and Gilmore Clark was the dean. 9 of the first 10 students to go to Rome were from Cornell. They then published these drawings. And you'll notice the drawing on the right here is the original. So to get things going, Gilmore Clark did the first drawing, even though he was dean at Cornell at the time. Griswold. Then other fellowships begin to take hold. This is the Charles Eliot Traveling Fellowship at Harvard. We all know Charles Platt. Charles Platt also had sons who became architects. And here is his son Clarence doing documentation both in plan and in section. So all of these things now become resources that are being published within the landscape architecture profession, influencing next generations of practitioners. Now, I wanted to just give a little taste of some of the guiding principles. And I think it's interesting, the follow-up, of course, that's happening in November here is on French design. And with these landscapes, especially with parterre gardens, I feel like you could have a debate and argue both sides, that it is both French and Italian. So I wanted to just pull out a few things from me that feel critical here. So here we are back at George Booth's Cranbrook. To the Italian Renaissance architects, gardens were a balance between art and the regular form of intended controlled growth and nature, the irregularity of unplanned and undisturbed outgrowth, and the relationship between human thought and human effort. So when we think about the breakers, the fact that the picturesque landscape predates the house, and when the house is rebuilt, it's on the exact same footprint, is that picturesque landscape the equivalent of art and nature? Is that there to celebrate? Is that there to symbolize nature? The other thing, too, which is incredibly American, is this notion of living outside, moving seamlessly to celebrate life between the indoors and the outdoors, and how all of these rooms, especially immediately around the house in the built architectural apron, support all of those activities. I couldn't help but show a photo that I took at one of the first opening events at the Blue Garden to show how these gardens today get to function just as they were intended historically. The idea that residence and landscape needed to function as a whole. Italians had discovered the best principles of siting a house in this landscape, which frequently established a clear relationship to a distant view. So if you're in the dining room at Rough Point, you're on exactly the center line of that bridge. It wasn't an accident when Olmsted Sr. moved that bridge further out along the cliff walk to allow freedom of movement for people who were not on the compound, but it also became a folly, a borrowed view from within the house. It's kind of a push for me to show Chateau-sur-Mer here, but I felt that because the borrowed view is, in fact, an Italianate building, I could apply that to that principle. But I'm much more comfortable when I'm showing you the long view at Villa Gambaraia, framing the view to the landscape beyond, which Ellen Shipman, Charles Platt's niece, replicates in Florida for Nina Kummer at their estate, now the Kummer Museum in Jacksonville. Symmetry, balance. I can't think of a better image to show you than this glass lantern slide from the Smithsonian of the original Blue Garden. And then this notion, too, of the architectural embellishments carrying you outside, the peristyle at the end of the music room, and the breakers as a blurring of the lines between inside and outside. The dappled light that's created by the flowering vines are part of that atmosphere and that garden magic that carry you out. But this notion of symmetry and balance is present in almost every one of these gardens that have an Italian influence here. The ultimate goal, adapt Italian models to conditions uniquely American in a distinctly American style. We've seen this image earlier today in a different context, in a building in a city. Here it is at Villalante. On the right-hand side, this little box here is the Harold Lloyd Estate in Beverly Hills, California. Here's Charles Platt. We're back at Faulkner Farm. And here we are for not J. Irwin Miller of the Miller Garden fame, who hired Dan Kiley, but his father, who hired Arthur Shercliffe and George Kessler to design a landscape that was inspired by that same pavilion. Garden elements, the serpentine column, these built elements that carry you out into the garden. And probably this to me is sort of ground zero, if you will, for the Italian influence at the breakers. Here is a fellow from one of the first American Academy in Rome fellows at the Villa Medici, and we could see that terrace alongside of the breakers. This is the closest that I can show you of something really taking and almost copying something identically. And I also think this pair of views is very interesting as well because, of course, we all know the pines in Rome and what they look like and how character defining they are. And when you look at this borrowed view and this land from the Breakers Terrace, you almost feel in those historic photographs that you're in Rome. It really does feel that way today. And then, of course, this notion of scale. At Ochre Point and at the Breakers, the largest of the Newport cottages, only the Atlantic Ocean could match the scale of the mansions when the gardens were built. We try to imagine what it was like when these were very small trees, and that these small aprons of formal gardens at each palace are like sketches of what such houses would have for gardens, given the space at the Palazzo Doria in Genoa, though now the rare trees fringing the lawns have grown enough to stand up to the architecture. So in closing, what I'd like to conclude with is 2 for the gardeners, 2 for the historians, and 2 for the stewards. For inspiration, I show you these images of the resurrection of Untermeyer's gravestone in Yonkers, New York. We can see the columns, and all of these historic photographs that I'm showing you are from the American Academy Fellows. These were taken by Lawson in the 1910s, Bobley Gardens, and then this is what, with our Paul Manship interpretation of the goats from Bobley. But this is what the garden looked like, and this is the garden resurrected today by this conservancy. The secret garden at Gambaraya on the left, and Vizcaya on the right. These are befores. Here is an after. I often talk about great bone structure, not just for Catherine Deneuve, but for gardens. And Vizcaya has amazing bone structure and a carrying capacity to accommodate tropicals that are much easier to care for today in the context of climate change than what might have been here historically. They're whimsical, they're reversible, and quite candidly, the public loves it. Then this notion of understanding, and I hope that after today maybe you might look at some of the gardens with fresh eyes, not just here but everywhere. It's always fun to me to look at a place that I think I know and want to understand the origins. I mentioned Swan House earlier. Here it is in Atlanta, Georgia. It's open to the public. The first fellows that were there were all documenting Italian gardens. If you know the Orto Botanico, which is the former Villa Corsini in Rome, these are the exact replication of those cascades. The image on the top left was taken by Mr. Lawson. Here is Mr. Lawson in a photo that I found called Miscellaneous People, measuring the cascade at Villa Corsini, which I should mention is always attributed to the architect Schutze. They were fellows together, they were lovers together, very controversial for Harvard's Philip Gorham Stevens at the time, but this is a collaboration. Here's, for example, a photograph of Ralph Griswold's collage with a contemporary photograph. So that really is as it was borrowed from Rome. Here's the box garden, which was restored by Spencer Tennell, and I'll just very quickly show you these 3 features. So we have the Baroque impediment from La Pietra, we have the basin from Villa Segonia, and then on the bottom right, we have the eagle at Villa Borghese in Rome. So what we see is this kind of taking of things and reappropriating them in these American gardens. And here we have it in Mr. Lawson's measured drawing, for example. And then finally, another garden, one of my favorites, below the radar, still privately held, Gwyn. This is the old Mather estate. Mather was the son was the head of the National Park Service back in the day. This is Charles Platt, Warren Manning, and Ellen Shipman. Here's the plan, and specifically the wild garden and the terrace, which is what I just showed you. The terrace is a direct knockoff of the Villa Mondragoni in Frascati, which is in Shepard and Jellicoe's book, and then the fountain and terrace. And then finally, we have the wild garden, which is just like Villa Giusti in Verona, which is open to the public. So in closing, just to come back to where we are and to look ahead, in most of these projects, the collaboration between architecture and landscape architecture was critical. For example, consider the parterres and terraces adjacent to the house. At the center of Hunt's plan for the breakers was a 2-story central hall opening onto first and second floor loggias, with 3 arches framing views of the sea beyond and the open lawn. The space recalled the cortile, or the courtyards of Italian Renaissance palaces, and opened the house up to the grounds and the ocean. In closing, I just want to note that of all of the landscapes that I've just shown you today, most of these were listed on the National Register in the 60s and 70s, and with the exception of a revisitation of the Swan House, which has been recent, none of these landscapes have significance in landscape architecture. So because they were done so early by architectural historians, they're only recognized for their building architecture. And as a culture that how we tell people how we value place, I think this is very important. So Biltmore, for example, revisited their nomination in 2004 and have wrapped around architecture, landscape architecture, but also the patrons. Vizcaya is designated for architecture and patronage, not for its landscape. And then finally, I've been really thinking about this notion of garden resurrection and how the birth of popularizing Italian gardens in America was also a celebration of antiquity, as a way to convey a value based on the fact that this landscape or these landscape features have stories to tell, that they are portals to wayfinding because of their very patina. And you know, the period in which we were creating these gardens, we were addressing this in the colonial revival as well. For example, this is Gunston Hall, where these paths have grown so narrow with 250, 300-year-old boxwood that you can't get a wheelchair through there, so that's a problem for a public garden, and you have to have alternative routes. But what you know when you look at that is that this garden is old. You don't know it looking at the house because along the James River there are so many new urbanist homes that have been built to look like this. Here we have patina and antiquity, I am not making this up, that are being managed by a renegade peacock population who are eating the lichens that are invasive, only in Portugal. And then I leave you, let's jump over the garden wall for one moment. This is an image from the Olmsted Brothers plan for Newport in the 1910s. And what's incredible to me, and I literally have goose pimples when I talk about this, is that the Olmsteds as planners were putting a value on nature and culture 125 years ago in a place like Newport. And when you look at the stately trees, you look at the stone walls, that the story of the antiquity of this place is conveyed through its very patina and antiquity. And that is a part, I believe, of what makes an Italian villa landscape or garden here in Newport and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charles, and we'll open it up for a Q&A. Please just raise your hand and I will come around with the microphone.
I ran a few minutes over, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Thank you for indulging that. Okay, if anyone's shy, I have a free copy, my only copy, of the Newport guidebook that the Cultural Landscape Foundation did. So the first question gets a copy of the guidebook. Oh, and we've got someone in the back. They want you to run as far as possible.
Getting my steps in today.
It's a really good lecture. Thank you so much for that. I really grabbed onto what you were saying about the American love for the ruined gardens that we're coming across, just because I've seen in my generation people grabbing onto eco-brutalism. And I wondered if you could talk more about why you think Americans really grabbed on to the ruined gardens.
Well, the ruin is, of course, part of the picturesque. It is also part of the Italian villa landscape. Parc Monceau, for example, by Alphand in Paris, which is the model for Olmsted and Vaux's promenades in New York Central and Prospect Parks, has ruins in that landscape. There are Italian villa gardens designed by Brian Fleming, who was an architect and landscape architect, where they constructed ruins to look historic. So Lincliffe, which was owned by the mystery writer Sue Grafton in Louisville, Kentucky until recently, has an Italianate ruin garden in the same way that Tower Grove Park in St. Louis in a public landscape has a ruin garden from the 1850s and 1860s. So I think that historically, I think it's things that grew out of the Grand Tour, people going to foreign countries and seeing ruins and then having an appetite for it. But again, it was about, I think, conveying this notion of a passage of time. And so, for me, I think one of the things I did want to say that I didn't say when I showed you Faulkner Farm, and because you look like you're all sitting together like you're the research people as fellows now, and the way that I would say to you that Faulkner Farm is what the High Line is today. Okay, so just to try to put that into perspective, that the High Line created a whole new typology for something that then went global. And I think in the US that Faulkner Farm was that equivalent. It was this cult that Wharton spoke about. And I do think the notion of ruin gardens is ripe for reappraisal. And the last thing I'll tell you to look at if you're really interested in this, and this is a place anyone can go to, is Ninfa. Has anyone heard of Ninfa? 1, 2. So Ninfa is in a floodplain. And so you can't reconstruct anything. And so all of the ruins there are part of Garden Follies now. And the landscape architect who was back in the day employed at the American Academy, she's created this botanical, horticultural exuberance that's all in a ruin. And it has this power of place when you're there because it has an authenticity. I don't know of ruins here in Newport that might exist, but I think there's a great public appetite to experience those types of landscapes today. I'm not sure if that answered your question. Thank you.
We have another question over here.
So thank you very much for your fascinating discussion. My question, I want to go back to the picture where you talked about use of tropicals. So how should we be thinking about using more native plantings and other environmentally friendly plantings to also stay consistent with historical intent and the landscape design?
I think the easy answer to this question is not to answer it in a vacuum, because I think if you're speaking as someone that's associated with a public garden or a nonprofit, and I work with a lot of boards, I think that all of your decision making has to be done through a consistent lens for both living and non-living materials. But I think that the great thing about landscape, and especially Italian gardens, is that the Italian gardens have such strong bone structure that what is most important are the visual and spatial aspects of that garden. If you're not familiar with the guidelines for the treatment of cultural landscapes, I know that's a very sexy government title. It's a hot link. You can go and find it. It's how you apply the Secretary of the Interior standards. So what we're talking about here is substitute materials, like you would have in building architecture. And so it would be through the lens of rehabilitation. So the question might become, let's hypothetically say, what do you say about the beech trees now, right? Because you can't even really just, in many cases, it's not even good to bring in new materials that may be infected. So you might look at color, scale, form, texture as a way to look at substitute materials. But I think each of those have to be on a case by case, and I think they have to be viewed holistically. And then lastly, I'll just say that there also has to be a pragmatism in terms of available maintenance dollars. I think a lot of places put a lot of energy into doing things that they think the public want to see, annual seasonal displays that require a lot of maintenance, that require a lot of watering. But then there's no return on that investment. It comes out at the end of the season. So I think you have to sort of look at these situations holistically and not emotionally. Because in a lot of places, they're the third rail. And I think you just want to proceed with purpose. Thank you.
We have time for one more question. If anyone, you can also save your question for the reception as well. Thank you so much, Charles.
Thank
and
you.
I think a last round of applause for Charles and the rest of our speakers today. Thank you.